Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural webinar on U.S.-China Generative AI Competition by the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. We are thrilled to have you join us today for the start of a series of webinars exploring tech advancement in AI. Our focus today will be the dynamics of competition between the US and China in the realm of generative AI. And these two giants are shaping the world, and their strategies clearly hold global implications. As we journey through this webinar series, I also invite you to tentatively mark your calendars for 2 additional upcoming sessions. The specific dates and speakers will be announced later. In the second webinar, we will delve into the domestic economic implications of generative AI for China. Specifically, we will look at its potential impact on China's labor market within the context of China's current economic slowdown. Looking further ahead, our third and final webinar will explore the effects of export controls, sanctions, and investment restrictions on China's access to advanced technologies. Additionally, we will also analyze how these factors might affect China's pursuit of domestic tech advancement. But first, allow me to introduce our stellar panelists and myself to you today. I am Lizzie Lee, Honorary Junior Fellow at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Joining me today are Karen Hao, former tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Ziyi Yang, tech reporter from MIT Technology Review, Jenny Xiao, partner at Lunas Capital, and Qiheng Chen, a fellow honorary junior fellow at the Center for China Analysis here at Asia Society Policy Institute, and also a senior analyst at Campus Lexicon. Thank you so much for being here. In the first few minutes of today's discussion, we will explore the importance of AI in US-China competition. As you know, today, AI isn't just a tech marvel, it's the axis around which global power dynamics tend to revolve. Its impact reach far beyond technology itself, influencing economics, national defense, societal shifts, and even international norms. So my first question goes to Qiheng. Qiheng, why has AI taken center stage in the strategic rivalry between US and China? And how do their tech advancement align with each country's broader global ambitions?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, Lizzie, and thanks everyone for listening in. Speaking of AI, so we have to understand that it is foundational technology, foundational to increasing productivity in every industry, and that's what makes it so essential to China's goal of industrial upgrading and pursuing high-quality growth in the future. And also, AI technology has this dual-use nature and has a wide range of military applications, and that makes it even more critical to the long-term goal of the Chinese government. And it is one of the areas that China actually has a pretty decent shot at catching up the frontier. And we also have to look at this thinking that, as we have seen from the internet economy, that if you're a technology superpower, and given the population of China, you're going to be an economic superpower. And with that, you're going to play an indispensable role in global governance and at the geopolitical stage. And the same thinking generalized to AI, leading from technology to economic and geopolitical superpower. And in terms of how the two countries are aligning their technological advancements with the broader geopolitical and economic ambitions, on the China side, so China is betting on quite a few strategic industries, and AI being one of them. It's kind of taking a quote-unquote venture capital approach. Even if China only has a 20% success rate at being very successful in 20% of those strategic industries, and that's still a huge deal. And China definitely has the resources and the political will to bet and invest in AI technologies.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
And on the US side, it's taking a more market-led approach, although we're seeing the progressives in office and a revival of the industrial policy. so this long-term competition will play on in the next decade or even longer time. And just to set up the stage, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Fascinating. So, Zhe, I'd like to hear from you next. Given the rapid growth of AI, which sectors do you think are poised to reap the most benefits? And on the flip side, which sectors might encounter disruptions in the near future?
Sure. Thank you, Lizzie. Actually, I want to answer the second part of the questions first. I feel like right now, the industry that feels most disrupted or threatened by the emergence of generative AI is the creatives. You're talking about like marketing writers, illustrators, models, or even influencers who feel like they have long thought that like their industry cannot be replaced by machines, but now there is like a relatively reliable competitor, a generative AI that can do their job. So that's why we're seeing a lot of the artists or like people who do in the creative industry fearing that maybe in a few years their job will be completely taken place by the AI. And then on the flip side, I think the industries that are mostly kind of trying to take advantage of generative AI are those industries that rely a lot on the creative work, but do not see that as their base. Like, I think one good example of this is like the gaming companies. Like, obviously, gaming companies need a lot of like visual assets to keep their games running. But at the same time, they usually outsource that to Illustrator. They outsource that to other companies. And right now, they feel like this is a great way. Generative AI is a great tool for them to kind of cut down on the cost, to cut down on the outsourcing, and to run on a better profitability model. So, which is also why we are already seeing, let's say in China, some gaming companies are the most kind of adventurous in terms of adapting and using generative AI technology. And also on the other side, I also want to say that not just industries using generative AI, but also industries supporting the development of generative AI are also very much in demand right now. So we're talking about chips, data centers, everything computing. These are the companies that kind of form the backbone of how the growth of generative AI, and they have a lot of great prospects in terms of their business right now.
Fascinating, great insights from both of you. Now let's dive into the state of China's generative AI development. As you know, they've achieved quite remarkable progress in recent years, especially in its capability. So, Qiheng, back to you. How has China's AI development plan influenced its journey in generative AI? And where do models like GPT fit into China's broader AI ambitions?
Well, China has been looking at developing AI very seriously, as I would say, since about 2017 with the new generation artificial intelligence development plan, and that's set the goals for where China wants to be in 2023, 2025, and ultimately achieving global leading to be a global leading player by 2030. But I would say the frenzy of ChatGPT actually took China by surprise. If you look at the development plans, China didn't identify the specific technological path to achieving the ultimate artificial intelligence, simply say AI in general. And the ChatGPT path, which is part of the transformer architecture family, is only one of the several ways to achieving that end goal. Mm-hmm. And it was originally proposed by Google back in 2017 and has developed to this day what we see as ChatGPT. And it took China by surprise at the end of last year. And then we see investment pour into this area, and policymakers are also paying attention. So back to how generative AI like models fit into China's broader AI ambitions. And now I think China knows this is one of the areas they can bet heavily in. So they have a target to direct the satellite investment into. And this belief that if you know what you're going after, and China's state-driven model can have advantage in catching up the technology frontier, whereas the Chinese model does less well when the target is moving and is kind of exploring the technology, but don't really know where is the sure path to success. So the success of OpenAI just point out a path for China, but China is still definitely quite far from the frontier and definitely has a long way to go.
Definitely has a long way to go. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, I want to hear your perspective now. Can you help us highlight some of the notable milestones China has already reached in its generative AI recently?
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Yeah, I think some of the milestones that we're seeing China reaching right now are quite similar to the milestones that we see in the US. There's really a mirroring effect that's happening across both countries. So when OpenAI first released ChatGPT, we then saw Baidu be one of the main companies in China that announced that they would try to develop their own version, and then they released ErnieBot. We've seen since then that there's been a proliferation of large tech companies, both in the US and China, and a ton of startups in both countries as well that are trying to catch up both to the other countries' companies and the companies within their own countries. And so you see things like Snap in the US that where they're releasing like chatbot features to their app, and then you see ByteDance release a chatbot feature to their apps. And with the open source movement that we've seen towards sort of a response to some of the more closed nature of AI models, we also see this mirroring of Meta releasing the Llama model open source. And then you see Baidu and Alibaba kind of responding with their own open source large language models. I think the two areas that might be more distinct for China, one is right now there's a huge chip crunch in China because of chip export sanctions that were placed by the US in October on China. And so one of the milestones that I think we should be tracking to basically figure out whether or not China can overcome this challenge is how many of these generative AI models are actually being built on domestic chips. And thus far, I think one of the only contenders is Huawei has built a large language model called Pangu on its Huawei Ascend chips. But that is still, it's a little bit difficult to tell whether or not China really does have a domestic chip that would be capable of bringing more generative AI applications broadly across the country. And I think the other thing is China's actually ahead in the respective regulation, which we'll touch on, I'm sure, later. But China's made more aggressive moves in trying to regulate this technology, both in some ways that we would not want to be learning from and in other ways that we would. And so that's sort of kind of the general landscape right now that we're seeing in China.
Very clear. Thank you so much, Karen. Now let's turn to the driving forces behind the tech advancement we see in AI, the institutions, the companies, and the researchers. Jenny, over to you now. Can you please shed a light on the major corporate players in China that are driving innovation in generative AI? And how are Chinese research institutions contributing to research and nurturing talents in this field?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think that's a really interesting issue to discuss. I think a couple of points that I want to make here. One is there's the usual suspects, the big tech companies of China that are pushing generative AI development, but it's usually more for product development and not for pushing the frontiers of generative AI. That's mostly because these corporations have been suffering quite a lot from the tech crackdown of a couple of years ago, and a lot of them were cutting their AI research and development teams a couple of years ago. And I remember just before ChatGPT came out, everyone in China, all the big tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, all of them were oh, we're just going to let go our AI researchers or, I'll get them to do product and do something profitable instead of doing AI research. So I think the funding from the corporate side, from the major corporations, is a little bit unreliable given how they are struggling themselves. I think in addition to the corporate side, the big corporations, there's a lot of startups in China that are trying to do generative AI. This has been a trend over the last 6 months or so. And a lot of people that I know have come to me or to other venture capitalists, and they were oh, I'm starting to AI company in China, do you want to invest? And unfortunately, we don't invest in China. And we just said no to everyone. But there were a lot of people out there who were really interested in starting AI startups. A lot of people, at least like 10 teams were like, oh, I'm going to become like the OpenAI of China. And my take on it is that they're not very consistent. So they're interested in AI for like 2 months, and then afterwards they're not going to work on this, which is unfortunately what happened, because a lot of these startups are pivoting, or they decided to like drop the whole idea of building Gen AI models altogether. You've seen like this really prominent co-founder of Meituan who came out a few months ago saying he's going to do a big Gen AI startup, and he's given up on that. And Meituan has like bought his Gen AI startup, and a lot of like prominent startup founders in China were like, oh, I'm going to like do an AI startup that builds Gen AI models, and a lot of them have kind of like rolled back their ambitions a little bit over the last few months. So I think this is a field that's definitely less hot nowadays compared with like 6 months ago. And on the institutional side, and like educational institutions and government funded institutions are probably playing a larger role in developing the fundamental technologies. And in particular, I think the universities of Tsinghua, Peking University, they're doing a lot of work. And also you're seeing like government private sector alliances, such as BAI, pushing out a lot of really interesting LLMs. And they were actually the first to go into the LLM sector before it was hot. They started pushing out models back in 2020. These are like GPT-3-like models, and they've been working on it for a couple of years now. So I'd actually say they're probably at the frontier of LLM R&D, whereas the corporations are more interested in the application side.
Right. Speaking of what corporations are interested in, are there specific products or use cases from these Chinese companies that have garnered attention from investors?
I think compared with the US, there is definitely a lot more, I think like the use cases in China are more concentrated. So everyone in China, like every other company in China, like Gen AI company in China, is a chatbot, and every other company is an image generator. It's just like very, very concentrated in a handful of sectors. And I think this is because their models are just aren't as good as the models that American companies have access to, and therefore they're not able to build more complex use cases on top of their technology. So it's really like very, very simple use cases. And I think what is interesting though is in Silicon Valley, like if you look at how many people are building LLMs versus building applications, there's like a lot more people building applications versus building the foundational models. Like there's only like a handful of major companies that are building foundation models, and like hundreds of application layer companies. Whereas in China, you kind of see a lot of people are building on the foundation layer because there is less of a clear winner in the foundation layer. So a lot of people are like pouring money into building, the OpenAIs of China, trying to become an API company. Whereas like in the US, like fewer companies are doing that. And in China, there's like a lot of application layer companies, but these application layer companies are usually concentrated in a couple of very simple use cases rather than the complex use cases that we're seeing in Silicon Valley.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. And as we start to dig deeper into the unique strengths and challenges that China and US each faces and brings to AI competition, Ziyi, here's a question for you. How do you think the research landscapes differ between China and the United States? And how do the talent pools of China and US compare in terms of AI research and applications?
I actually think there are a lot of similarities between the research environment in China and in the US. There are a ton of research talents, and there are actually a lot of collaborations going on too, like research institutes working with each other. I will point you to a report published this year by the Stanford Human-Centered AI Center, I think. What they're finding after kind of like going through all the scientific publishings of AI is that China has published way more papers than everyone. However, in terms of like the impact, the citations, the US US still leads there. So we are seeing that a lot of Chinese researchers are working really hard and very diligently, but they're still catching up to kind of the knowledge advantage the US researchers have. The other thing the report also pointed out is that even though there are still more collaborations going on and happening, the pace actually slowed down. I think that actually speaks to the larger environment of kind of like scientific collaborations, like freezing and slowing down, which I believe Karen actually can talk more about that. But yeah, that's like one of the things we're seeing that like actually they might go on more kind of separate roles from now on because of like the geopolitical tensions, everything else. The last thing I want to note is that I think in both countries, we're seeing that a lot of times the companies actually take a more leading role because there's a very high cost that comes with developing generative AI models because of you need to spend on chips that's training and running the algorithms. So sometimes the institutions don't have that much financial backing to justify spending on that years over years. And the companies, especially the companies that feel like they have a chance to be like the first mover or to have an advantage in the industry, they are actually more financially capable of investing in it. But we're also seeing like kind of like them then cooperating with the academic researchers, like funding their research in terms to like getting their research using their product. So we're seeing like really a lot of them tangle together. But I think in this case, like US and China don't differ that much.
Not that much of a difference. Thank you so much, Zeyi. So Qihong, I know this relates to your research. Can you talk a little bit about data accessibility and data availability in China and how pivotal is that issue, if that is an issue in China's progress or further progress in AI?
Right. So the conventional recipe for success in AI is talent plus data plus computing power. And I would say data is one of the three areas among the three that China has the most ability to mobilize resources and have control over. And China has been, in the past several years, have been engaged on the efforts to optimize the allocation of data resources, meaning that unlocking the data that are now used by one party and making that available to other parties that have a better use cases for the data. And we have seen initiatives to establish data exchanges to facilitate this kind of reallocation of data resources. But the degree of success, I would say, is still questionable at this point. To my knowledge, the vast majority of the exchanges still happen off the exchange, meaning that it happens directly between the two parties, not through the exchange. But China is also trying pretty hard at unlocking the value of public data, pushing government agencies to release public data for AI training and for use in AI applications. It's still work in progress, and but I would add to a caution to this conventional thinking that China sits on a vast trove of data is that China's PC or the internet ecosystem may not be as developed or as a long history as the US, that you may not have this an ocean of data to scrap from and to fit into large language models. More data is in the mobile ecosystem, which is more closed off and is controlled by the big corporations. And so it still remains to be seen if China is really abundant in training data for large language models.
Really important caveat. Thank you so much, Qihong. Jenny, I want to hear your thoughts on this. You mentioned this sort of distinct path between fundamental models, LLMs, and applications between US and China. Are there other sort of niches or specializations that each country is leaning toward at this moment in generative AI, as far as you can see?
Yeah, I think a lot of traditional trends that we're seeing in the mobile era also applies to the Gen AI era. Specifically in the US, a lot of companies are building B2B products. These are like products that serve other businesses. These could be like products for the financial sector, for healthcare, if you're serving like doctors, or say, you're serving lawyers, like legal tech products Whereas in China, most of the products are 2C. So like these are like products that directly serve customers. And the big difference between these two types of products is that 2C products tend to be more hype driven. So people are like super interested in this app and everyone's like downloading it. Whereas like B2B products are more like, oh, we need to like do enterprise sales. We need to get all these like big companies using our products. And China has always been very good with the 2C play, but like very bad at 2B, because a lot of Chinese companies don't want to buy software. And this has been a bottleneck for Gen AI companies in China. And they're like, oh, I really can't sell software. No one's going to buy software. They only want to buy my product if I provide consulting. And this is a trend we continue to see today in the Gen AI era. On the 2C side, I've actually seen some pretty cool applications. A lot of people are building chat apps for gaming, like NPCs, and also people are building, I don't know, like AI girlfriends, boyfriends. That was like a whole trend a couple of months ago. And also people are building stuff like, like AI, like psychologists or whatever. And there's a lot of like really cool 2C products. And also in addition to language generation, a lot of folks are building video generation, right? Like short form videos. That's something that TikTok brought to the US. That's like getting pretty big in China. I've had like a couple of companies, come up to me and they're like, hey, I'm building this short form video generation generation platform or generation app. It's also a form of Gen AI, but like less talked about in the US. And like there's a lot more interest in that in China. But I just wanted to like double click on a question that we were talking about earlier, which is like data accessibility. I think what is interesting here is I heard a couple of companies tell me or like tell other venture capitalists that they have exclusive access to some government data in China because they have like a close relationship with some sort of like government official, or they were guaranteed by local government that they can get access to like all of the hospital data in their province or all of the hospital data in that certain region. And that's like really interesting because for US companies, that kind of data is really, really, really hard to get. A lot of like health tech companies in the US are really struggling to collect data, and I think they absolutely envy the data access that a lot of Chinese companies have.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. We already sort of touched upon this a little bit, but let's talk more about regulatory landscapes in both countries. Chi-Heng, how is the regulatory environment in the U.S. shaping the development and deployment of generative AI technology, and also for China?
So the U.S. is still it's a very early stage of developing concrete laws on AI. Still in the discussion stage of how to go from the general principles to very concrete harms, and to map out what existing regulations can be applied to harms originating from AI, and what new regulations specific to AI need to be developed. We have seen a kind of whole of government approach to addressing the governance of AI. You see quite a few agencies within the US government claiming that the AI fall under their regulatory power. Notably, on the discrimination and bias side, you have the joint statement from FTC and 3 other agencies. And also the White House, pretty notably, around the end of last year, issued the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights that basically laid out 5 principles and mapped out how local and federal efforts tied back to those 5 fundamental principles. And again, about a month ago, you see the voluntary pledge of several leading AI tech companies that they're pledging to having robust red teaming and also watermarking their AI products. So you have seen this industry-led, this bottom-up efforts coupled with the top-down, some of the guiding principles, and forming the early stage of the AI regulatory landscape in the US. But it's going to take quite a few years for the Congress to really materialize any AI regulation if there were to be any. And in this vacuum, the tech companies would just need to navigate the water and having a robust internal compliance and risk management programs and helping shape the discussion on AI regulation.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, I also want to hear your insights. In what ways do you think China's regulatory approach toward AI differ from the approach employed by the United States?
China is definitely much more aggressive, and it's also much more top down. Like Qiheng mentioned, that in the U.S. it's really driven bottoms up by the companies, but in China it's the government that's really setting the pace on what they want to see generative AI used for and where they do not want it used for, or the ways that it should be developed and shouldn't developed. And we've seen this just generally in a lot of like cybersecurity and internet regulation. China sort of tries to keep up with the clip of technology development, in part because of a fear that when you have new technologies that could really influence the information ecosystem, they really want to try to contain that as quickly as possible. So you see in a lot of the regulations or the laws that come out, whether it's a cybersecurity law or there was like a deep fake synthesis regulation that was just enforced in January this year, you'll see this language like any algorithm or any generative technology that has social mobilization capabilities needs to make sure, like the companies need to make sure that they kind of button up their technologies and don't end up influencing the internet environment, the digital ecosystem, to misalign with the party. But at the same time, because of this aggressive clip, China has also been quite ahead in some other areas that are more aligned with sort of Western democratic or liberal values. Like watermarking was one that Qiheng mentioned, where a lot of US companies are exploring this idea of how do you inject some kind of digital fingerprint into these generated outputs so that it's easier to track on the internet, so that you can reduce misinformation risk. That's something that the EU has also introduced into their regulatory frameworks. And now that's something that China has also introduced, whereas the US still doesn't really have like a formal law at the federal level that is looking at requiring something like that. So this is what like some China policy analysts have sometimes told me is like the sweet and sour approach of Chinese regulation. Like you get a little bit of parts that you're kind of concerned by, and then other parts that are actually, it's very clear that China is listening to the global regulatory discussions and trying to pluck things from the EU discussions or the US discussions that they think would also be quite beneficial for their environment.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. Another common question I receive about China's AI capability is the effect of the censorship regime, which can cast a significant influence on information flow and the direction of technology. So, Zeyi, your thoughts on this? How does China's approach to internet censorship intersect with its AI development? Are there instances of AI technologies being utilized or adapted for surveillance or censorship? And how does censorship interact with AI?
Yeah, so actually, when Jenny just mentioned that, like, in the West, a lot of actually in both countries, a lot of the generative AI are used for like 2C products. So this means that everyone can access like the models and ask questions and get their answers. The problem that comes with that is that there's a lot of unpredictability when it comes to what people are going to do with the models. And that is a big risk for Chinese companies, because China has had this like very comprehensive censorship system that goes into basically every social media platform. So they also need to kind of like adapt that censorship machine into the emerging generative AI products that's going to introduce more like unpredictability, introduce more sensitive conversations. So I think what we have seen so far is that the Chinese companies have been very careful navigating that landscape, especially like there have been a lot of Chinese companies releasing their AI products, but very few of them have opened them like completely accessible to the public. They're going to require you to register with a real name. They're going to require you to register with a business entity. way. So they kind of want to control the risk in terms of like what people are going to generate and what people are going to attribute to these companies when it comes to like contributing in the production of this kind of sensitive discussion. So that's very interesting, and we didn't really see it here. The other thing is that we are kind of seeing how they approach this question from a technical standpoint. Like, do they just block certain keywords from being asked, which is more like the search engine, like the Web 2.0 censorship mechanism, or do they use something else to try to prevent the models from saying things that the government doesn't really want to hear? For example, I think recently Biden's released their, like a week ago or something, Biden's released their own kind of like ChatGPT bot alternative, and people have realized that if you ask a question, let's say about the Chinese political leaders, the Bidens will actually generate the answers first, and you kind of see that as they type the answer. And then once it's done, it will again block that and say, actually, this is like a politically sensitive topic, and we could not generate that for you. So this is like a new territory. Like, people don't really know how to censor a AI model, so they're trying all kinds of ways. But I feel like soon, like, they're gonna find maybe there's like an industry standard in terms of how to censor this kind of conversations. Unfortunately, I think that's gonna happen soon. And again, to another part of the question, I don't think we have seen much of like how generative AI has contributed like innovatively to surveillance yet, because it's still very much in development. But we're more seeing kind of a continuation of the previous challenges to freedom of speech, to access to knowledge, like replicated in generative AI, because all these companies are so fearful of the political liabilities that they may have for introducing models without having some kind of guardrails there.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Ziyi. Jenny, back to you. How does the general public in China perceive generative AI, particularly in the context of state censorship? Are they getting around it? Are they just complying with censorship? What are the workarounds? What are your strategies and reactions?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think a lot of general public are very concerned about the censorship. I don't think a lot of them are very aware of the censorship, including the ones that have like played around with these tools. Their reaction is, oh, this tool is like very dumb, right? It's not a very good chatbot. It's not as good as the chatbots in the West, and they're not aware that that's because of the censorship layers, like behind the scene. And actually, like interesting anecdote, a Chinese CEO once complained to me that his chatbot can't even count from 1 to 10 because there's 8 and there's 9, which is, I always think this is a really funny story, but it also tells you how dumb the Chinese chatbots are. And I think, you know, the general public usually complains about it from a user experience perspective. Like, the user experience isn't great, the chatbots are kind of dumb, they're not really aware of the deeper causes. And if they are, they're probably used to it, because this is like what the Chinese internet looks like. This is what Baidu, what all the search engines look like. So it's not particularly strange to them. But I do think the AI community in China is very aware of censorship requirements. And this is one of the main barriers to them releasing better chatbots. This is one of the barriers for them to make better products and make more innovative uses of their products.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. So we are coming to a close of the formal discussion part of our session, but I really want to hear Karen's perspective. This came up during our offline conversation. We talk a lot about U.S.-China competition, but let's just not forget that there are still opportunities for collaboration. What kind of opportunities for U.S.-China collaboration do you see, Karen, between the two countries in the realm of AI?
Thank you, Lizzie. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, because I do think that the competition lens sometimes dominates the discourse so much that we really do forget how much cross-border connection there is, and how much we should be fostering that in cases like generative AI, where it is a really transformative technology and it's going to be global and borderless, and you're going to want to have some kind of like international norms around it. I think in AI already, we've seen like AI before generative AI became the term of the day. We were already seeing so much U.S.-China collaboration. There's this Macropolo study that showed that it globally, like a third of the AI talent comes from China, a third of it comes from the US, and a third of the talent in the US comes from China. So there's just looking at people-to-people flow, there's a constant exchange of ideas that's happening. And there can be continued collaboration on beneficial applications like AI in drug discovery, scientific advancement, education applications, financial applications, things that are just generally beneficial, or like helping combat climate change, improving healthcare outcomes. And the other area that I think cooperation is really important is the risks and the harms. And we've seen some efforts with this. The Beijing Academy of AI hosted a conference that Jenny actually pointed me out that brought together some of the leaders in China and the US on AI research. So Sam Altman appeared digitally. There was an executive from Anthropic that appeared digitally. There were professors from MIT, from Tsinghua, from Baidu, from all of the major firms that were talking about some of the ethics and harms and making sure that together, like these two big AI superpowers are actually communicating with one another on what should be the guardrails moving forward for developing this technology. So I think both the benefits and the risks are really, really important areas of cooperation.
Fascinating. Qiheng, the world is not just the United States and China. How might other countries, position themselves in this whole US-China AI competition or collaboration? Where are the other countries in the picture?
Right. So my base case is that the technology companies will come from China and the US. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the countries will just need to see where you are standing. So EU will still be super relevant because of its regulatory power and competency. And you may also have some other developed countries that have a very open system of open engagement with the United States that's going to benefit from access to US AI technologies, while also open to governance cooperation with EU and the US. And then you may also have another group of countries that I think the top concern is more about equal access to AI technology. So that's one dimension of looking at where other countries sit. And another dimension is looking through the lens of geopolitics. I'm quite worried about that we're going to see a bifurcation of the AI ecosystem. One is US-led and one is China-led, and we don't see much interaction between the two, not just in terms of talent and technology, but also in terms of governance. And you see governments that may have a demand for censorship technologies may resort to Chinese companies to fulfill that demand. And this bifurcation will have much wider implication in terms of the global AI governance.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, back to you again. What are some of the ethical and societal considerations both countries should prioritize as they advance in the realm of AI?
There's so many. Well, one thing that's top of mind for, I think, a lot of people right now is this challenge around misinformation. So a lot of these generative AI tools, they are not truthful because there is no sort of knowledge base that it's drawing upon. This is called hallucinations in the technical world. So that's a problem that really needs to be thought about. Just whoever is developing generative AI tools, whether it's US, China, or elsewhere. Also, protecting workers' rights. I think we're seeing a really big wave now of, like with the protests in Hollywood, of workers in many industries feeling a lot of squeeze. So you also mentioned like influencers feeling this pressure where they think that they could be replaced by generative AI, or even the threat of being replaced is starting to put pressure on their wages, their job security, their economic outcomes. So those are areas that I think both technologists and policymakers around the world should really be collaborating on to figure figure out how do we ensure that as we move into an increasingly automated generative world, that we still have dignified long-term jobs. And I think the last that I'll mention is like data privacy and consent. Like there's also a really big global debate now around whether or not we should be allowing all of our data to be consumed by these technologies to create them. And artists are kind of protesting this, journalists are protesting this, and comedians, actors that are all sort of challenging this idea that their content that they put online under different circumstances should then be just used wholesale in the production of these technologies. So I think that's another area that, regardless of where these tools are developed, and even for jurisdictions that aren't necessarily developing the tools, but are actively thinking about how to regulate when the tools come to their jurisdictions, that should be a really big area that should be sorted out.
Looking into the future a little bit, Jenny, what disruptions or innovations could emerge on the global tech landscape due to US-China competition, due to development of AI, as far as you can see?
Yeah, I'll talk about disruptions first. Just going back to Chi-Hung's point that there might be a bifurcation in the AI world between the US and China. There's going to be like a US AI sphere, and then there's a China-led AI sphere. I have no doubt that that's going to happen. And in fact, this is already happening. Just give you like a very, very concrete example. Nowadays, it is almost not impossible, like very, very, very hard for like US investors to invest in China. And this has like a couple of downstream effects. One is China's AI landscape is really going to lack the venture capital that's needed to grow a lot of these applications. A lot of funds in China that have like a very strong AI focus are telling me that, oh, they can't raise capital from the US, but because traditionally 90% or 70% of their capital, their money comes from US university endowments. And these endowments are pulling out of China-based funds because of national security risk, and because I think the Biden administration came up with a couple of policies that prevent American investors from investing in China. And also there's this very big venture fund in China that is also like a branch of a US fund that received a letter from Congress a couple of weeks ago warning them about investing in China, and also like asking them to appear in front of Congress to explain what exactly they're investing in and what they're doing. So on the capital side, I already see these as two distinct spheres. It's very hard for Chinese investors to invest in the US either, because there's like all sorts of KYC rules that US AI companies put in place. And these are like KYC, know your customer. That means they have to do background checks on all of the investors. And the US has a lot of like very strong like investment restrictions for China-based investors investing in the US. So like I really think these are like two very distinct spheres. A lot of American companies are suspicious of people with Chinese work experience, especially if they work for like ByteDance or Baidu. They're always worried, are you going to like steal my technology and give it to a China-based company? So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption, and there's going to be two spheres. And on the innovation side, I think what's interesting is I think the competition is definitely pushing hardware innovation in China, as all of these companies are switching in China. These China-based companies are switching to their domestically produced hardware. That pushes innovation on the China side. And also on the American side, because there's this risk or fear of China, a lot of government agencies are pouring more money into supporting AI research, especially like fundamental research. And I think, there might be interesting innovations that are coming out from this competition, but I'm more worried about the potential for a US-China AI arms race.
With that, that concludes the first part of our discussion today. Now let's turn to some questions from the audience. The first question is for Ziyi. What are the other strategic industries in China besides AI?
Sorry, is this about kind of like what other industries could utilize AI more? That's how I understand the question.
So I think the question is about the other strategic industries in China.
So
not
outside
just
of AI.
Yes, outside of AI.
Right. I think right now, I mean, Chinese tech companies are already having a moment because they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of users in China and also sometimes outside the countries too. I think a few industries that I really focus on, one is electric vehicles. China is kind of like the world leader on that. It's like years ahead to a lot of the other countries. So that's one industry where you can see really kind of the energy transition happening in real time. And you kind of can use that as the example to see how other parts of the world will kind of answer to the question of energy transition. Other things, I would say chips. Chinese government has made it very clear that it really wants to invest in chips, not just for AI, but for a lot of other uses too. So how are Chinese companies going to rise up to the challenge or not? How are they actually going to kind of challenge the current Western domination in terms of cheap manufacturing? That's also another interesting thing to look at. The last industry I will mention is just that there are a lot of like the to consumer tech industries in China. They are really prosperous because there's just like a huge user base in China, like 1.4 billion people. The great example is e-commerce. Chinese e-commerce companies, platforms are very developed, have very comprehensive features when you compare it to, let's say, Amazon. So that's also a front where you're really seeing like kind of a lot of the technology innovations, including generative AI, like being applied to real world use cases like very soon, basically like as the first adopters of these technologies. So yeah, this kind of like to consumer, very human labor intensive in tech industries. I think those are very interesting to watch too.
Fascinating. We have another question from our audience for Karen. Do you have a take on the state of non-generative AI in China, like pattern recognition, decision support, etc.? For example, the application cases could be autonomous driving, cars, drones, etc. Where are China currently in those fields?
Yeah, I think AI is non-generative AI has sort of, in the same way that it has in the US, sort of just become kind of part of the digital infrastructure in China now. It's sort of hard to point out any application that doesn't use some kind of pattern recognition or some kind of machine learning that's happening. And I think this is where sometimes when I talk with Chinese developers or engineers in the like consumer app spaces, not for generative AI, but like ByteDance, there's always this question of like, oh, is there something about the AI that is super ahead in China that is making ByteDance have like a stronger recommendation algorithm or something like that makes it become really viral globally? And this is where it becomes like, often people say that it's not really about the AI, like the people working on the technology, they're like, it's not about the AI at that point, because once AI is infrastructure, it's kind of commoditized. Everyone kind of has similar versions of it. And at that point, it's actually more just the product design, the user experience, all of the other different features that are being put into these technologies. I think the flip side of that is when it comes to something like autonomous driving, which is like, it's like a different category of AI applications. This is where, again, it's not necessarily about the AI, it's actually about the policy that is leading China to potentially start getting ahead, because in self-driving cars, a lot of automakers mention that they actually need regulation for this particular application to advance, so that they know what kind of safety guidelines they should be designing to on the roads, and they have some kind of framework for essentially the blame of what happens in an accident. And China has been more aggressive about pushing out these kinds of regulatory frameworks, which enables more innovation in that space. So I think, I guess to answer the question, like if you were to compare the US and China on like non-generative AI technologies, it's kind of almost the same now in terms of the actual technical infrastructure. But the ways that we're starting to see differentiation is from the other aspects of the technology development, whether it's the regulatory environment or the like user experience, product design aspect of things.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. Another question from the audience for Jenny. How should young people get prepared?
Prepared for
like
AI
for like AI field future, I guess. This is a kind of a job security question.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'd say like just get into AI. That's my biggest piece of advice. If you're like considering, hey, should I do banking? Should I do consulting? Should I become a lawyer? I just say like, whatever you do, try to equip yourself with AI skills and try to really understand what's happening in this space, so like that your job doesn't get disrupted. And I think, you know, young people should always be more entrepreneurial, always like try to be at the edge of technology instead of like waiting to be disrupted. Another piece of advice in the context of US-China competition, and I hate to say this, but I always tell young people or like my friends, pick a side. Like whether you want to be in the US or you want to be in China, if you want to start a company, if you want to work somewhere, pick a side. Like this is not an era where you could be cross-border, where you can like have a career in both countries. That's going to get harder and harder. I think for young people, they really need to pick a side and like be very clear what the trade-offs are and be very determined to like stay in one country or the other. It's going to be very hard for them. It's not the 2010s anymore. It's going to be hard for them to build a career in both countries.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Another question for Qiheng. Would you say China has much more potential in terms of high quality data, which can be collected from different sources without the concern that we normally have in the West, such as privacy concerns and, you know, GDPR, et cetera, et cetera?
I think that depends on who are the data processors you're looking at and what are the incentive structures. If you look at the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law, it has quite a few similar features with the GDPR that you see and pretty robust protection of data privacy in China. But add on to that, I would say there's an emerging view among some of the scholars in China is that the GDPR is too stringent and it actually has a negative effect on innovation. And China definitely doesn't want that. And you're going to see more discretion in terms of how the government is going to enforce the laws, including the PIPL. And they're going to think about who are the winners and who are the losers. They're not going to let everybody worse off. If you look at the mobile app transparency requirements and the enforcement on mobile app privacy, and you see the government focus on enforcement on the big players. And there's some research that has emerged saying that it has helped driving up the user engagement rate of those big apps because people trust more of the data privacy being protected at those big apps, and smaller apps benefit from more new download and new users signing up because they're switching away from the big apps. So you're going to just see more practical enforcement that's going to keep an eye on innovation, not just regulation.
Thank you so much, Qiheng. Another question, I'm going to give this one to Karen. How do you see Hong Kong's role in China's AI ecosystem?
It's a great question. I think Hong Kong's role is very confused right now. I think it used to be a bit of a connective tissue in that, you know, Western companies could use Hong Kong as a bit of a launching pad to get into the China market, and Chinese companies could use vice versa, Hong Kong to get out. But at the moment, because there is such a big bifurcation that's happening between the US and China on AI technologies, we're actually seeing a phenomenon where Hong Kong is becoming a bit of a no man's land where no one wants to offer their technologies in Hong Kong anymore because they just don't know what the rules are. So ChatGPT is not offered here. TikTok's not offered here. There's like a lot of other examples that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but slowly that are sort of chipping away at just Hong Kong not having anything. But on the flip side, I guess the one like positive spot that I do see is there has been a really strong role for a long time of Hong Kong universities doing a lot of AI research and having lots of collaboration with Chinese universities and US universities. And so at least in academia, in the open source domain, there is still that connective tissue that's happening through Hong Kong. And I personally hope that Hong Kong does find a way to kind of get out of this no man's land and continue to be the connective tissue on the commercial side. But unfortunately, we're just not seeing that right now.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. And that concludes the Q&A portion of today. Thank you again so much for all our panelists for your insights, and thank you for your time. Until next time, stay engaged, stay curious, and stay informed. Once again, this is the inaugural webinar on US-China Generative AI Competition brought to you by the Center for China Analysis of Asia Society Policy Institute. I'm your moderator, Lizzie. Thank you so much for spending the hour with us. This is amazing. And please stay tuned for 2 additional sessions in this series. That's all for today. Thank you so much, and see you next time.
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度关注中国，一个动作招来中国的邻国们齐刷刷的抗议。8月28日，中国自然资源部配合中国2023年全国测绘法宣传日及国家版图意识宣传周，公布了新版的标准地图。这个版本的地图除了将台湾纳入中国的领土范围，并将主权存疑的包括钓鱼岛、南海诸岛等列为国家重要岛屿之外那么这个地图也应将中印边界的争议地区也显示为中国领土。但对于中国的这个新版标准地图，印度方面是表达了抗议。根据 BBC 的报道，中国最新标准地图将印度东北部阿努纳查邦，中国称为藏南地区，以及与新疆接壤的阿克塞钦地区纳入领土范围而引发争议。对此，印度的外交部发言人巴格奇说，这种主张没有根据，强调印度方面拒绝接受。他更强调，中国的此类举措只会使边界问题变得更加复杂。印度外交部部长苏杰生在8月29日接受印度的媒体采访时，也批评中国的说法很荒谬。中国甚至在过去就曾发布过地图，宣称对属于其他国家的领土提出主权要求。他说这是中国的老习惯。而针对印度方面的强烈抗议，中国外交部发言人汪文斌在8月30日在例行记者会上说，那该2023年版的标准地图是依法行使主权的例行性做法，希望有关方面客观冷静看待，不要过度解读。自2020年6月中印两国在拉达克地区加万古斗殴，并导致印度军方20人丧命之后，双方屡次在这个喜马拉雅山边界的地区爆发零星冲突，中印两国关系不断恶化，这是自1975年以来双方首次发生致命冲突。那中印争议边界超过3000公里，其中印度实质治理中的这个阿鲁纳查邦，中国称之为藏南地区，而阿克塞钦大部分地区目前则是由中国有效控制。中国民政部自2017年起已对阿努纳查邦境内许多地区进行了3波的重新命名。印度外交部则重申，中国自定创造地名的尝试不会改变作为阿努纳查邦完整且不可分割的事实。稍早印度总理莫迪与中国国家主席习近平在南非金砖国家峰会期间发表演讲。一名印度的官员随后说中印两国同意在有争议的边境地区共同努力缓和局势。那在马上要到的9月份9月初，20国集团 G20 峰会即将在印度登场。印度的纽时18新闻网在8月29日引述印度高层官员说，新版的这个中国地图是在印度总理莫迪在南非与中国国家主席习近平会面之后， G20 峰会即将举行之前发布。中国显然是因印中关系未有明显改善而感到沮丧，进而诉诸于宣传攻势。他进一步说，中国非法占据了许多地区，全世界都知道中国是扩张主义者，强调中国地图不合法，阿努纳查邦是印度领土的一部分。而继印度外交部提出抗议之后，中国发布的这个2023年版标准地图还引发了另一国的争议。由于地图纳入与马来西亚存在主权纷争的南海范围，马来西亚外交部在8月30日发声明说拒绝接受中国的这份地图，批评中国做出单方面主张，该地图对马来西亚没有约束力。中国的这份2023年版标准地图，其中有关南海的主权范围与马来西亚沿着婆罗洲、沙巴和沙拉越州海岸外的专属经济海域重叠。马来西亚方面说，南海问题复杂而敏感，必须根据相关这个1982年联合国海洋法公约等国际法展开对话与谈判来和平解决，理性处理争端。 马来西亚又说支持制定东南亚各国正在谈判的这个南海行为准则。马来西亚是声称拥有南沙群岛中的11个岛礁主权，这与中国声称拥有主权的南中国海域相重叠。这些岛礁包括马来西亚在1979年派军占领的拉央岛这个也叫中国是叫做弹丸礁，还有距离沙拉越名都鲁54海里的詹姆斯浅滩中国叫做曾母暗沙，以及沙拉越岸外的巴丁夷阿里浅滩，中国是称之为南康暗沙。马来西亚外交部2021年曾就中国飞机与船只进入马来西亚领海和领空2次传召中国驻马来西亚大使。第一次是马来西亚空军2021年5月31日侦察到16架中国军机飞入马来西亚在南中国海的领空，此指是严重威胁马来西亚国家主权。中方则称中国空军只是在南沙南部海域进行例行训练，不针对任何国家，也没有进入他国的领空。马来西亚外交部在当时的6月3日召见中国驻马大使，并递交外交照会，提议抗议中国军机入侵马来西亚的空域。马来西亚政府也指出，中国的海洋综合资源调查船大洋号及2艘中国海警船2021年9月侵入马来西亚位于南中国海的专属经济区。马来西亚外交部在同一年10月4日还传召中国驻马大使抗议此事。而关于中国的地图在今年年初北方那部分也有过故事。在2023年的2月，中国自然资源部发表了有关地图内容的新规范，其中针对中俄边境的8个地名，要求在现行的这个俄式发音的地理名称之外，还要加注中国的旧称。当时日本产经新闻驻台北的支局长石坂明夫对此还有一番调侃，他说：难道中国是准备要收复失土了吗？当时石坂明夫在脸书分享此事时指出，上述的8个地区在中国的历史书上经常出现，过去都属于大清领土，但在最近200年内陆是连续丢失，现在都是俄罗斯的领土。中共制作的地图一直是用俄语的现行名称标记，这一次在俄罗斯陷入乌克兰战争的泥沼之际，中国突然宣布地图上要注明旧称，引发了非常多的遐想。这些地区包括弗拉迪沃斯托克要加注海参崴，那乌苏里斯克要加注双橙子，哈巴罗夫斯克要加注伯利，那布拉戈维申斯克要加注海兰泡，那萨哈林岛要加注为库页岛，涅尔琴斯克要加注尼布楚，那尼古拉耶夫斯克要加注庙街，斯塔诺夫山脉要加注外兴安岭等。这些土地在过去都是中国领土，在1858年清朝战败之后，与俄国签订了这个爱辉条约，和北京条约将他们割给了俄国。但是随后中国的历代政府都不承认这些条约的合法性和有效性，直到江泽民上台。江泽民在上台之后，与俄罗斯签订了议定书，将中国的100多万平方公里的领土是划给了俄罗斯。上述8个地区那江泽民还将图们江出海口划给了俄国，封死了中国东北通往日本海的出海口。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注6度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。
This past Thursday, Japan began releasing treated radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. This is water that was used to cool the damaged reactors after the nuclear accident, which occurred there in 2011. Japan seems to be taking every precaution. They managed to filter out almost every radioactive element except for tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen, which is quite difficult to separate from water. And so for this, they have diluted the water to ensure these levels are low. They've lowered the level of tritium to less than 10 becquerels per liter. To put this in perspective, the WHO sets the limit for safe drinking water at 10,000 becquerels per liter. So, I'm no expert on nuclear waste, but at least it's clear that according to established standards, they're being quite cautious. They're also releasing this water incredibly slowly. They have about 1.3 million tons of contaminated water they need to release eventually, which is enough to fill 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And as of right now, they're only releasing 7,800 cubic meters, or about 3 Olympic swimming pools, and that's over the course of 2.5 weeks. So they estimate the entire process will take them about 30 years to release everything. Despite their caution, the response from the Chinese Communist Party has been nothing short of hysterical, immediately banning all seafood from Japan, describing the release as a selfish and irresponsible act. The Japanese are actively monitoring samples from sea wildlife and have found no evidence of abnormalities or issues from the release thus far. But despite this, China, it seems, has suddenly decided to steward the health and longevity of our oceans. Miles, what's your take on this development? Is this sincerely environmentally motivated on behalf of the CCP, or is this simply political retribution of some sort?
No, it's not environmentally based at all. It's not even science-based. The Chinese government use issues like this to score a geopolitical point at Japan. The Japanese government has been pretty responsible in dealing with this issue. The U.S. government has no problem with it. State Department spokesperson said the Japanese handling of this nuclear wastewater release is, quote, safe, transparent, and science-based, unquote. South Korean government does not have a problem with this because they are participating in supervising the release, and they're showing the data. There are some localized protests in Korea, but it's very small in number, and government has no problem. The Taiwanese government is cautious but has no problem with this because the data is indisputable. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has no problem. It has approved the Japanese releasing its water because the science is there. The amount of tritium in the water content is way below what's required. The radioactive element tritium even meets the WHO standard, is way below the WHO standard for drinkable water, is 1/7 below that. This fanning of the hysteria against Japan domestically is very unfortunate. It shows the government really is running out of ideas about anti-Japanese sentiment. Create mass hysteria, censor any dissenting, even moderating a voice inside China on this matter. If you say Japanese is being responsible, you'll get in trouble. Police will knock on the door. So that's how serious this issue has become inside China. It's ridiculous. And also the government of China unleashed avalanche of harassing phone calls to Japanese public service hotlines, emergency lines. Chinese government acts like a hooligan. This is the problem. If you want to put this thing into perspective, the Chinese government itself runs a lot of nuclear power plants. They also routinely dumps wastewater into the ocean. China has about 13 reactors, contains as high as 10 times more radioactive element tritium than the WHO standards. So this is a total hypocrisy. The funny thing is, because of the state-staged hysteria inside China, the real victim of this Chinese government's cynical move against Japan is basically the Chinese seafood industry itself. Japan's seafood export into China is not really that significant because Japanese seafood industry mostly is geared for its domestic consumption. But the entire seafood industry in China right now is devastated. Nobody wants to eat seafood. It shows you the fundamental difference between two models of governance between China and Japan.
The seafood industry in China is taking a hit. Is this due to China's own dumping of radioactive materials, or what is the apprehension that's causing this in China?
The apprehension goes like this. Japan dumped the radioactive water into the ocean, and then that contaminated the ocean current will take to the Chinese water where the seafood will be harvested, put on the Chinese dinner table. In the information environment that is China, you do not have any counterbalancing views. You don't have any science-based discussions. Government censored all the information it does not want people to see. So in China right now, seafood industries suffer devastatingly. Many seafood restaurants are closing down. And another thing is, for some reason, some people, the urban legend says, salt could mitigate the problem of contaminated seafood. So right now in China, the most coveted items in the grocery store is salt. There's a national craze for buying salt. This sounds like a very, very bizarre and surreal.
The firestorm of hysteria that China has created in an attempt to damage Japan's reputation has backfired. And just to highlight the hypocrisy of this a little bit more, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that there's probably no force in this world at this time more destructive to our oceans than the Chinese Communist Party. They seem to have no concept of long-range sustainability in our oceans resources, overfishing not just in their own waters, but across the globe. They have the largest deep-water fishing fleet in the world with nearly 3,000 ships as of 2022, just devastating fisheries across the globe with very little capacity for other countries to not only compete, but more importantly, rein these fishermen in. And so in their case, it's not even the selfishness that they accuse Japan of, it's actually just stupidity, because if they irreparably devastate these fragile ecosystems, they themselves will not have access to the seafood and delicacies they're currently trawling the world for. And you've highlighted the degree to which they themselves dump radioactive material. If we look at toxic human and industrial waste, which not radioactive is certainly profoundly devastating to water supplies, China has already contaminated as much as 90% of its own groundwater with dumping, as well as the improper use of fertilizers and pesticides, such that nearly 70% of their rivers and lakes are unsafe for human use. So, Miles, I mean, have you seen any, obviously this is sort of hysterical hypocrisy, but have you seen any meaningful measures from the CCP to reduce their impact on their own water supplies or the world's ocean? And if not, I mean, what can we as the U.S. do to play a role in reining them in?
Well, you mentioned something that's very important. That is, we talk about China being a contaminator in the world. We talk about the air. We talk about the water. Yes, it's totally true that China, in the blind pursuit of economic growth, almost completely ignored the ecological consequences of its greatly forward style developments and policies. And that basically, completely destroyed China's ecology. But there's also something else you mentioned that's very interesting, because China has long depleted the ocean lives and seafood resources along its shores and its water near its coast. So China has a global illegal fishing industry that affects most coastal countries in the world, as far as even to the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador. So this is a global issue. China just doesn't care about international law, and let alone ocean resources sustainability. And I think there is a lack of global coalition to deal with this Chinese illegal fishing on the global scale. And that's something I can see that in the near future, there will be some kind of a global coalition to deal with the issue, because this is very serious. China's ocean-going fleet is illegally fishing in other people's territorial waters and EEZs, along, for example, in Argentina, in Brazil, in West Africa, in Ecuador as well.
Next topic, the recent BRICS summit in South Africa garnered quite a bit of attention. For a brief refresher for our listeners, BRICS is an international organization whose name is an acronym for the 5 member countries. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And its stated intention is to rival or provide an alternative to Western-led forums like the G7. We've talked about BRICS before, Miles, but if I recall, there's been in the past uncertainty about how serious of an organization it was and the degree to which friction between certain members would inhabit serious cooperation. But with this past summit, there was a rush of interest from nations to join. Before the summit, it represented 40% of the world's population and a quarter of the world's economy. And Xi Jinping, we've known, has wished to expand this. And both China and Russia, but perhaps especially Russia, are desperate to counter the prevailing reputation they have as pariah states by bringing new allies and partners into their orbit. Dozens of countries have expressed interest in joining. And on the final day of the summit, it was announced that 6 new countries will be joining BRICS. That is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This is the first expansion of the organization since South Africa joined in 2010, and it is undoubtedly a historic moment. But Miles, I want to ask you, how significant is this development really? Could you speak a bit to what BRICS actually is and does, and whether it presents a real challenge to the U.S.-led international order, especially now that these countries have joined?
I mean, this is basically an effort to create some kind of a new bloc, collectively called the Global South. And China wants to play the leadership role in that coalition. BRICS is a very peculiar organization because it has some kind of, overt purpose of replacing, or at least created a an alternative to the G7, G20, and some other West-led political and economic blocs. But unlike G7, for example, BRICS really lack something that's fundamental. That is, there's virtually no common values upon which to build a coalition. Some of the countries like India, Argentina, and Brazil, they're democracies, no matter how flawed, imperfect they are. But they have a fundamental democratic mechanisms. Other countries, basically, they were rogue countries, like Iran, like Russia, like China. You put all those together in a group to counter what they said is a West-led group. I mean, it's going to be very difficult because not everybody in the BRICS organization really is anti-West, right? So, which brings me to the new membership. You mentioned Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Argentina, and Ethiopia. Some countries were just downright opportunist. They joined it because China has this habit of giving a lot of money. Xi Jinping went to South Africa, and in Johannesburg, he pledged $10 billion to the BRICS. And a lot of people were just obviously coveting the Chinese giveaway. China acts as if it's now finally in the leadership role, commanding global discourse power. That's an illusion, because China does not have the credibility to be a global leader. China does not have the credential to lead the world, precisely because it lacks the right kind of value, right kind of institution to do so. If the world is going to look like China today, and the world is doomed. So not everybody in the BRICS wants to see the world to be run like the Chinese Communist Party is running China. There's also another dynamic inside the BRICS. There's no way CCP's claim to leadership will be readily accepted by countries like India, Russia, because there are a clash of egos, there are a clash of ambitions, there's also a clash of agenda. I mean, if China really cared about this global south, China should support India's membership in the UN Security Council as a permanent member. So China and Russia would not let it happen. It's all a clashing of a very peculiar countries. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to be able to provide fundamental challenge to the G7-led world economy.
To press a little bit further on this lack of, any sort of moral direction or shared moral understanding and this lack of leadership you've highlighted, I want to call our attention to a comment a colleague of ours, Walter Russell Mead, made on a new podcast from Hudson Institute that I would encourage our listeners to check out. It's called Arsenal of Democracy, which just launched recently, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for broader commentary on U.S. foreign policy. There he said, perhaps cutting against our own arguments about China and Russia's status against pariah states, that China and Russia are offering a deal to many of the world's elites, in particular in developing nations, that might be more enticing than what the U.S. offers. Whereas we attach certain moral expectations to cooperation and participation, the CCP doesn't care about human rights abuses. They don't care if elites engage in international money laundering operations, or if they're involved with cartels or other nefarious organizations. And they won't press these elites to democratize or even work towards more just domestic rule. So I want to ask you, Miles, do you agree with this categorization, and how enticing is this really on a broad scale internationally? Would an arrangement like this have enough currency with enough of the world's nations such that China could build an opposing international community on these grounds?
Not really. You said well. I mean, it will be very enticing to the elites of various countries, but ultimately it will not be appealing or enticing at all to the people of those countries. China has adopted this kind of approaches to approach to many countries: Kenya, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Angola. In each of these countries, when the deal that you're talking about was revealed to the people of those countries, the people raised severe and sometimes violent opposition to the deal reached by their own elite with the Chinese government. So this is a challenge that China has to face. It is very easy for China to basically capture the elites of various countries, but it's almost impossible for China to capture the hearts or minds of the people in those countries. How to deal with China has become inevitably the number one sovereign and political issue that showed up in various countries' the elections. Sri Lanka, for example, Malaysia, it's the same thing. So initially, China would claim victory in forcing those countries into Chinese orbit with deals disguised as a Belt and Road projects. And in all of the countries, you see strong backlash ultimately to change the policies of this country toward China. I'll give you two examples, right? Malaysia is very important. Another one is Sri Lanka. So you can see that emerging in countries like Kenya and many other countries. So I'm not entirely sort of bought by that kind of argument.
Well said. Well, for our last topic, we have been covering for some time the downward spiral of the PRC's economy. And some commentators are beginning to argue that we're not just seeing decline, but perhaps the possibility of collapse between massive youth unemployment, the numbers for which the party has simply stopped publishing, crippling deflation, a crisis in the once booming Chinese real estate market, crushing debt for local governments, and devastating demographic issues, and as well, deep distrust, both from outside corporations and within China. It's hard to see a road to recovery. Miles, can you give us an update on this? And I just want to ask you, do you think a catastrophic economic collapse is actually possible or perhaps even imminent?
Well, let me just look into the inner logic of Chinese economic model. It's fundamentally flawed. In a certain way, the Chinese economic model looks like a gigantic Ponzi scheme. It goes something like this, right? Chinese system is a socialist system. In other words, the government owns what they call the means of production, particularly the land. All land is owned by the government. So government basically is able to get some money, particularly local government, by speculating on land sales. So the government uses a monopolistic ownership of land to sell those land to developers through some kind of a scheme, particularly like a LGFV. It's a local government financing vehicles, which is the sort of organization that uses government-owned land as collateral to borrow enormous amount of money from banks and investors, and then give the money to local governments, upon which to build the buildings and housing. This kind of industry has collapsed. And the Chinese real estate industry is exploding. LGFV couldn't pay back the loans they owe the bank, and risking default. And the default is on a gigantic, massive scale. The total local government debt, mostly facilitated by LGFV, is close to $9 trillion. That's about half of China's entire GDP. Okay, so you ask me whether it's going to explode, collapse or not. You can get the easy answer from that reality alone. Now, the real estate collapse is a very, very big deal. That's also adding to the exploding factor. Evergrande filed for bankruptcy. This is one of China's largest real estate firms. 2 weeks ago, they filed bankruptcy in New York City. 10 days later, on August 28th, it resumed trading in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It lost 86% of its value at the opening, ending up the day as nothing but a junk stock, because Evergrande is in debt of $2.38 trillion RMB, yuan. That's equivalent to $330 billion, right? And then a few days later, another China's huge, gigantic real estate firm, Biguiyuan, also defaulted nearly $20 billion debt. This has a cascading effect. Right? It not only make a lot of people victims of this Ponzi scheme, but also fundamentally shatter the confidence of the consumers. So people don't want to spend money. If people do not have confidence in the future of the economy, they don't want to spend money. That really affected the production, and so the industry is going through a vicious cycle. I think the Chinese economy is in big trouble. China is trying to look for its own salvation through the international banking system, through private equity and venture capitals, the big ones like BlackRock. Ultimately, I think China has to swallow its own bitter pills.
So obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but it seems to me, we can't just consider these economic problems in a vacuum. These have political implications. And we've seen over the past year backlash, protests from many Chinese citizens in response to economic issues or in response to, bad healthcare coverage, things like this. But that is largely ordinary Chinese citizens. Are we heading towards a point where the economic ramifications are starting to affect the elites? I mean, we talked about going after immigration consultancies. If it has a substantial effect on the elites in China who have benefited largely from China's economic growth up until this point, what sort of political ramifications might that have for Xi Jinping and for the party as it stands?
Well, the elites in China, they have their vested interest. And China has all sorts of ridiculous, unrealistic policies that go fundamentally against the international market mechanism. I'll give you one example. You mentioned about the crackdown on immigration consultancy. China had this ridiculous currency control that allows each individual to transfer no more than $50,000 out of China. And that is the ironclad law. If you go beyond that, you'll be a criminal. Now, there is a very strong trend inside China to immigrate to countries like the United States. And one of the most important way to do so is through investment. Visa type will be EB-5, for example. Now, the minimum requirement for the United States to give an immigration visa for investing in the United States is $800,000. So if you want to immigrate to the United States, going through that channel, which is the most popular, by the way, a lot of Chinese have come to the United States using that $800,000 investment visa category. Now, that would mean you have to send $800,000 to the United States to get your visa, but you are only allowed to transfer $50,000 a year. So it will have taken you about 16 years to get the money out of China. That's why the immigration consultancy say, you know what, I can do it for you through different kind of shenanigans. And so of the tens of thousands of Chinese middle class, well-off people who have immigrated to the United States using that visa category are literally made a criminal. So that's why when the Chinese government goes after the immigration consultancy, demanding the consultancy to hand over the case files, you can see a lot of people who have immigrated to the United States do not want to go back. Now, there's also another thing. Many of the people who have immigration visas through investment in the United States, they do not live in the United States. The visa in the United States, passport in the United States is just a plan B. So many of those wealthy people, their economic basis are in China. So this is why the Chinese government now is going after those very well-off people inside China to extract money from them without any immunity. That's the scheme. So you can see this all related to politics and policy.
Hey, everyone. 在12年前，福岛核电站因地震而发生熔毁，反应堆的冷却系统受损。东京电力公司 TEPCO 开始向设施注入海水，以防止反应堆过热。这些受到放射性物质污染的海水被储存于厂址附近的储罐中，其中部分已存储长达12年之久。日本的解决方案是对这些水进行处理、稀释，然后释放到海洋中。这种逐步释放经过处理的受污染水的过程将持续30年。这一方案已获得多个无关国际组织的批准，包括国际原子能机构 IAEA 以及联合国的核监督机构。科学家们也同意进行废水释放。驻福岛的国际原子能机构 IAEA 表示，经过独立的现场分析显示，排放水中的氚浓度远低于每升1500贝克勒尔每升的运营限值。这个限值比世界卫生组织对饮用水的限值低6倍，后者为每升10000贝克勒尔每升。根据国际原子能机构的机器监测，目前排放废水中的辐射水平为每升205贝克勒尔 BQL。虽然和专家似乎普遍认为 将经过处理的废水逐步释放到海洋中，不会对人类或海洋生物产生长期影响。围绕废水释放的科学共识的问题之一在于，随着科学的进步，科学领域的专业化也在不断增强。虽然和科学家一致认为辐射水平应该尽量降低，但美国国家海洋实验室协会呼吁加强对海洋生物影响的研究。在日本、韩国和斐济，抗议者仍然反对将废水释放到海洋中。马绍尔群岛和塔希提岛的政府也感到担忧。中国还宣布将暂停从日本进口水产品。绿色和平组织发布了一项研究，指出放射性同位素的长期环境影响尚不清楚且研究不足。重要的是要承认人们强烈反对释放经过处理的废水的原因。在日本，广泛存在着对广岛和长崎核爆事件的文化创伤。有关核爆幸存者及其子女健康障碍的普遍焦虑至今仍然存在。这种文化创伤在许多太平洋岛屿上也存在，这些岛屿靠近美国的核试验场地。日本国内对政府和安全政策的怀疑部分是由于许多广岛核爆幸存者未接受治疗，反而被美国和日本的研究人员用作研究辐射中毒和暴露影响的试验对象。福岛核事故是一个明证，表明日本政府未能履行其在核电站确保适当安全措施方面的职责，这削弱了公众对政府的信任。不仅普遍如此，而且特别是在核项目和清理方面确保公民安全的能力上。原子科学家公报引用了一份报告，称福岛核电站事故是政府、监管机构和东京电力公司之间的勾结结果，他们实际上背叛了国家免受核事故威胁的权利。东京电力公司 TEPCO 在核电站废水储存方面也发生了几起事故，导致废水泄漏。2013年8月 TEPCO 披露有300公吨高度放射性废水从储罐中泄漏出来。2013年10月 TEPCO 披露另一个储罐正在泄漏，一些高度放射性废水可能流入了海洋。2014年2月 TEPCO 披露一个被错误保持开启的阀门，导致约100公吨高度放射性废水从储罐中溢出。2016年10月，大约32升高度放射性废水从储水罐的接缝处泄露出来。由于政府未能充分制定气候变化和环境保护政策，对政府的不信任也在更大范围内存在。随着极端天气事件变得越来越普遍，今年夏天创下了创纪录的高温，很明显，政府未能在全球范围内充分解决这个问题，他们往往更愿意淡化气候变化危机的严重性，而不是制定真正的政策来监管那些是世界主要碳排放源的大型企业实体。对许多气候活动家来说，政府的利益显然不会将环境或地球放在首要位置。重要的是要认识到，只有在积极承担责任的情况下，政府才会采取负责任的行动。正是在全球密切关注和国内行动主义的背景下，日本政府才制定了处理废水的计划。同时，也是在2021年中国和科学家的呼吁下，国际原子能机构才参与了对废水释放的监测。让我们讨论一下中国在这则新闻报道中的角色。由于对福岛核电站废水释放引发的担忧，中国决定暂时停止从日本进口水产品。这一举动实际上可以被视为一项战略性举措，旨在日本的计划周围制造争议，并在全球媒体格局中展示自身的影响力。通过强烈反对废水释放并强调潜在风险，中国可能旨在国内外引起公众关注，从而对日本施加压力，同时展示自己作为关心环境和公共安全问题的负责任行动者。这可能有助于在日本的计划周围制造争议，并将中国定位为环境和海洋生物的保护者。此外，中国在这则新闻报道中的参与还可以被视为其在全球媒体上扩展影响力的努力的一部分。传统上，西方新闻机构一直主导着全球媒体格局，而中国一直在努力通过增加在国际媒体中的存在， 塑造与其利益一致的叙述，以抵消这种主导地位。与美国之音和自由欧洲电台有关的事实核查机构 Polygraph 声称，中国在歪曲福岛核废水倾倒风险方面的主张，凸显了当今媒体格局中信息战的复杂性。政府和各种行动者经常利用新闻报道和事件来推动其议程，这使得新闻消费者在批判性地评估信息源和信息时变得至关重要。中国通过社交媒体账号网络放大对日本释放废水进入太平洋的批评，这些账号推广亲中国的影响者将国家支持的叙述推到社交媒体的对话前沿。Navina Hayden 是居住在中国的德国移民，他发布了一段反对废水释放的视频。
So recently there was this very concerning incident where Japan released the radioactive contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean. So recently you can see a lot of discussions on Twitter on how harmful this water actually is. But I'm here today to provide another viewpoint regarding the legality of this incident. So what you need to know first is that Japan's decision to release this radioactive contaminated water was made unilaterally, and this unilateral decision is against the two most important international environmental laws, the London Protocol and the UN clause. According to those two laws, any environmental intervention that has a potential transboundary impact must be discussed with the stakeholders, the countries and the local communities prior to this decision. So therefore, Japan's decision caused a lot of countries, including but not limited to China, to feel opposition, they feel panic, and they feel fear. The impact of this is that now China has banned the fishery import from Japan, and I see a lot of Chinese people refuse to eat fish that was imported from Japan.
此外，中国的批评者声称，中国对日本水产品进口的禁令是虚伪的，因为许多中国核反应堆释放的废水含有远高于福岛水平的放射性污染物。另一位推特用户 Gabriel Wildo 表示，这种观点错误地阐述了北京的实际担忧。他们担心放射性同位素，这在正常废水释放中是不存在的，因此将其他核电厂的穿水瓶进行比较是无关紧要的。这种担忧在韩国也广泛存在。他还引用了一篇新华社的文章，批评日本的计划是不合理和不负责任的行动。从福岛核电站释放的废水经过过滤和处理，已经去除了污染水中的62种放射性核素，将符合国际原子能机构 IAEA 的安全标准。国际原子能机构已经发布了一份详细的报告，详细说明了他们的保护和认证程序。中日关系的紧张局势在这位在日本的中国视频博主中引发了一种受害感。
我们现在打电话报警，问问这个老板什么意思。中国人なんですけれども、なんでこう書いてるんですかって話させてください。それはまあ聞いてみないと分からない。中国人に対して書いているっていうのに怒ってるのか、それともこの福島県産の食材を使ってることに対して怒ってるのか。いや、福島産の食材はどうでもいいんですけど、なぜ中国人へって書いてあるそういうことなんですよ。そういいですか、中に聞いてきたんですけど、やっぱりそうですね。要は中国人に対してっていうあれじゃなくて、ここに来る方のために。要は福島県産のものを使ってるから、もしそもそも入る前の段階として、だから嫌なんだったらそもそもうちには入らないでくださいね。中国人としてこれは国籍差別につながると思いますよ。何がつながる？なぜ中国さんの嫌がる方がいらっしゃるから、そういう人たちのためにここのお店自体は福島県産の。本人が喋ったなぜ中国人へ？特にニュースで最近そういうふうになってるんで、こういうふうに書いてる。でそれは国籍差別なんですよ。いや、かもしれないです。勝手なお店の経営者の判断、権利があってやってることなので、警察はこれこんな書きゃダメだっていうのはできないんで、ですけどお話聞いたらこれ日替わりで結構書いてること変わるらしいんで、また明日には書くこと変わるみたいです。今日は変わります？じゃあお伝えはできるけど、変われるかってどこかわかんないです。それはもういやどう思います？あ、よくない。じゃあ書き換えるって言ってるんで、お願いしますよ。 就贵死了。国籍差別ですね。差別ですね。
在这段视频中，一个中国视频博主感到在一家餐馆遭到歧视，餐馆老板在窗户上挂了一块写着“告诉中国人，本店全都是福岛产的”招牌。这种受害感和歧视感可能部分受到前大阪府知事桥下彻 Toru Hashimoto 和前宫崎县知事东国原英夫 Fideo Higashiko Kuburo 的影响。他们在一次采访中表示，进入日本的中国游客应该喝福岛受污染的水，吃福岛的海鲜，还可以在福岛的海里游泳。福岛核废水释放问题越来越被政治化，被视为中日紧张关系的一个问题，这掩盖了日本、韩国和斐济等国的老百姓对释放行为的担忧。虽然可能是媒体叙述煽动了他们的恐惧，但轻视他们的真实担忧是适得其反的。为了缓解人们对受污染海产品的担忧，日本首相岸田文雄发布了一段视频，展示他吃福岛的生鱼片。尽管中国对日本水产品进口的禁令可能具有象征性或误导性，但希望它能够解决该地区一个非常真实的问题：过度捕捞。虽然沙丁鱼种群自然会因为海洋环境的变化而波动，但捕捞可能会增加饲料鱼类崩溃的频率和强度。2015年发表的一项研究直接发现，捕捞压力加剧了饲料鱼类的自然种群崩溃。太平洋沙丁鱼种群自2006年以来已经减少了 95%， 现在已经低于维持商业捕捞所需的最低水平，称为截止点。感谢收看本次的华尔街前线报道。
大家收看华尔街电视的智库报告节目《中国财政空间的神话》。荣鼎咨询：中国的财政能力现在非常有限，因为北京的税收体系依赖于即将结束的投资驱动增长模式。房地产和土地市场的疲软导致国内财政赤字扩大，这将减少北京未来的政策雄心，包括对战略产业的支援。地方政府债务重组也将产生巨大的短期财政成本。重组中国的财政体系是必不可少的，但可能涉及新的税收，包括对家庭和消费者征收税费。传统观点认为，中国存在许多经济和金融问题，但北京有财政空间来应对这些问题。中国中央政府债务占 GDP 比例仅为 21.3%， 与美国的 119% 和欧元区的 91.6% 相比，非常低。大多数分析师认为，中国可以利用这个空间重组地方政府债务，同时保持其他经济政策优先事项，如对战略产业的补贴和融资。实际上，中国的财政能力受到严重限制，整个财政体系都是围绕投资驱动增长的收入而构建的，而这种增长正在减缓。税收相对于经济规模的比例持续下降，房地产市场的下滑也影响了土地销售收入。实际财政赤字，包括中央和地方政府预算，约占 GDP 的 6%至7%， 并且可能保持在这个范围内或上升。当然，这样规模的持续赤字可以在国内融资，但它们不仅将限制北京对战略支出的雄心，还将限制未来支援经济增长的财政刺激的使用。中国2022年的政府总债务保守估计接近 GDP 的 142%， 这包括中央政府债务、政策银行债务、地方政府债务、地方政府融资平台 LGFV 债务以及学校和医院等机构的其他隐性债务。显然，除了中央政府债务以外的每个类别，对北京来说都是有条件的，而不是正式的负债。但它们也是立即有条件的，这部分债务很可能会被纳入中央政府的资产负债表，并且很快。中央政治局关于经济的中期报告中承诺采取全面措施解决地方政府债务问题。这样的重组将减少北京应对其他政策优先事项的财政能力，并且很可能限制未来地方政府投资增长。因此，中国的财政空间理念值得重新考虑。 地方政府的不可能完成的任务，维持投资增长，无论宣布哪些措施来解决地方债务问题，都可能会减缓未来的地方投资增长，从而在未来几年影响经济增长。北京面临的挑战是在不加强允许债务水准上升的道德风险的情况下，维持市场稳定和地方政府的融资管道。另一个关键任务是寻找一种可持续融资地方政府投资的新管道。地方政府负责中国大部分社会服务，而北京控制大部分税收收入，并向地方政府转移资金以满足其需求。这一结构是在1994年的税制改革中创建的，旨在限制地方政府独立筹集投资资金的能力。此前地方支出激增，邓小平南巡后通胀率超过 20%。尽管北京在1994年实施了限制措施，但地方政府继续相互竞争，以产生投资、就业和经济增长。为了规避北京的监督，地方政府依赖土地销售作为地方层面的刺激基金预算收入来源，并通过地方国有企业或融资平台向地方银行借款来进行准财政支出。银子银行和非正式借贷补充了向地方企业和 LGFV 提供的正式银行贷款。地方政府在扩大投资的同时，根本无法偿还现有债务。2022年 LGFV 资产回报率中位数为 1%， LGFV 债务的利率平均为 5.36%， 现耗尽。地方政府投资现在占 GDP 的约 14%至15%。如果地方政府收入继续下降，地方政府或 LGFV 突然失去信贷来源，那么中国整体经济的投资、就业和增长将受到影响。地方政府需要更低成本的融资管道和新的收入来源来偿还债务并扩大投资。但更广泛的政策问题是，北京希望在未来10年看到多少地方政府投资增长。为了防止再次出现债务问题，投资增长可能会放缓，但下降的速度尚不清楚。中央和地方税收不平衡。根据中国的财政结构，大部分税收收入在中央和地方层面共用，然后中央政府进行转移以满足支出义务。2021年，地方政府税收的两个最大来源是加值税占税收收入的 38% 和企业所得税占 18%。加值税收入与工业产出和制造业密切相关，包括出口部门。中国的企业所得税支付给承在企业总部的省级政府。2021年，中国超过一半的企业所得税支付给了上海、北京、江苏、浙江和广东。因此，地方税收的两个最大来源偏向高收入省份，使他们对中央政府的财政转移依赖较小。由于中央政府控制税率，贫困省份不得不通过罚款或行政费用来寻找额外的非税收入，或者他们已经严重依赖土地销售。中国税基最薄弱的省份最容易受到疲软的房地产市场、土地收入下降的影响。房地产市场的下滑加剧了地方财政收入的压力。但即使在房地产市场最近的下滑之前，地方基金预算赤字已经在扩大。这主要是因为2014年至2020年的棚户区改造计划中，土地开发销售前的支出一直在增加，该计划涉及对搬迁居民进行补偿。自2021年以来，土地销售下降速度更快，这对地方政府基金预算的收入和支出两方面产生了影响，因为土地不需要通过对搬迁居民进行补偿来准备销售。2022年，土地总收入下降了2万亿元人民币，预计2023年将进一步下降 1.4 万亿元人民币，同比下降 21%。土地和房地产销售的下滑也影响了加值税收入。2021年，预售销售额从 14.7 万亿元人民币下降到 10.3 万亿元人民币。将 9% 的增值税率应用于预售收入，2022年加值税总收入大约下降了4000亿元人民币。这是有意义的，因为即使房地产销售大幅下降，如果将 9% 的税率全面应用，销售额低于一定水平的开发商只需支付 5%， 预售住房的加值税税收约占加值税总收入的 19.1%， 占中国总税收的 5.6%。近年来，中国的隐性财政赤字不断扩大，土地销售收入的疲软导致了这一趋势。自2015年以来， 地方政府和地方基金赤字的扩大，推动了中国总体财政赤字从2011年至2014年的平均占 GDP 的 1.5% 扩大到过去3年的平均占 GDP 的 6.3%。预计2023年的总赤字将保持在这个水准左右。赤字扩大部分与疫情时期的减税措施以及2022年第2季度的大规模加值税退税有关。但税收收入的下降是一个更广泛的趋势。税收收入的普遍下降反映了财政体系对投资驱动增长的依赖。随着近年来投资增长放缓，中国的税收相对于经济的比例也下降。总税收从2014年的 GDP 的 18.5% 下降到2022年的 13.8%。以名义价值计算，中国整体税收收入的增长平均仅为 4.4%。相比之下，经合组织成员国税收占 GDP 的比例一直在 30% 以上，并在2021年达到 34.1%。中国对国内消费的税收2022年总税收的 10% 和个人所得税 9% 很少。如果投资、工业和制造业产出放缓，中国的税基也将变弱。这一过程似乎已经开始。在当前的税收体系下，以消费为主导的增长意味着更宽的财政赤字和更弱的财政支出能力。值得注意的是，2023年迄今为止，国内消费税收下降 10.6% 和个人所得税下降 0.6% 都有所下降。对于地方政府来说，重组其收入来源的紧迫性更大，因为土地销售收入不太可能恢复到以前的水准，也不会为增长提供可持续的基础。调整可以通过改变现有税收分配、税率、支出水准或支出责任的形式进行。一个选择是减少增值税收入归中央政府预算的比例，地方仍然只能获得加值税收入的 50%， 但要承担总支出的 80%。长期以来，房产税一直被视为地方的另一种收入来源，而且在某种程度上仍然是必要的。然而，现在在房地产市场低迷时，对其征税可能会遇到更多的政治阻力。房产税对于弥补中国的财政赤字不是一个万能药，因为经合组织国家的房产税收入平均仍然低于 GDP 的 2%。中央政府还可以承担更多的社会服务责任，特别是地方未筹资的养老金义务。增加中央政府的支出责任将减轻地方政府财政压力，但会增加已经高企且不断增长的财政赤字，并可能取代其他支出优先事项。在集中税收收入的同时，提高中央政府税率可以增加北京对地方财政状况的透明度，但这也可能会增加地方政府依赖非预算融资的动力，因为更严格的监督可能会导致地方官员在实现多个目标时承担更大的责任。增加新的税收也是必要的。扩大中国税基最明显的地方可能是国内消费税，目前仅涵盖汽车、酒精和烟草等物品。这可能应该扩大到更广泛的消费品范围，或者以零售销售税的形式实施，但显然这也会减缓消费增长和再平衡。另一个选择是对互联网平台公司的与数据相关的消费服务征税，考虑到中央政府最近强调数据作为中国重要经济资源之一，间接的，这也可能给中国的家庭带来压力，缩减北京的财政雄心。中国受限的财政能力的真正影响将是限制北京雄心勃勃的长期政策目标。随着中国继续相对于 GDP 运行大规模赤字，进一步增加赤字以刺激经济变得更加困难。同样，财政收入并非无限，而且相对于经济规模而言正在缩小。北京将在未来难以继续维持政策目标，或者不得不在这些目标之间做出权衡。过去5年，中国的养老金和社会保障支出年均增长 8.3%， 随着中国的劳动年龄人口减少，增加的社会保障支出将占据地方预算的更大比例。在过去10年中，中国的国防支出年均增长 8.2%。随着 GDP 增长率继续下降和收入来源面临压力，计划以当前速度继续增加国防支出的计划将受到税基下降的限制。北京可以始终将国防支出作为高优先事项，但不太可能比整个经济增长得更快的扩大。为了使中国经济为低碳未来做好准备，环境技术投资将需要数万亿元的新投资。 只有一小部分可以通过财政支出直接资助，但使用商业条件来融资，此类投资可能会减缓整体建设。中国在发展战略性产业自给自足方面的产业政策，包括双回圈计划，将依赖于更难以维持的政策引导性投资。科学技术相关支出仍然是一个优先事项，对基础研究的关键国家实验室的预算分配将保持不变，但地方政府对应用研究和战略性产业投资的资金将需要在地方层面的其他优先事项之间进行权衡。中国依靠政策银行的对外贷款来资助海外基础设施，扩大政治影响力和扩大自己的出口市场。但政策银行近年来在这些贷款上遭受了重大损失，自2020年以来，估计有780亿美元的海外贷款出现违约或正在重新谈判。现赞比亚之后的中国外债重新谈判，在国内财政义务不断上升的背景下，当局可能会对进一步借款或资本重组这些银行，以吸收损失并为新兴市场提供债务救济表示犹豫。中国的财政能力今年比过去要有限得多，迫切需要对中国的财政体系进行改革，以适应未来的消费驱动增长模式，包括调整税率、税收范围和中央与地方政府之间的收入分配。在那之前，北京将难以将财政政策作为有效的逆周期工具或实现长期政策目标的手段。谢谢大家收看华尔街电视的智库报告节目。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场。今天早些时候，贺明先生在讨论节目的时候啊，贺明先生说，下周一啊，我们放假，我们要不要连线啊，保持节目能够继续呢？真的是为了保持思想先驱报和华尔街论坛不中断啊。有的时候呢，我们觉得在家，通过远程连线的方式，希望呢也能够在假期的时候啊按期工作。我一想啊，这眼见劳动节都到了。接下来这一年剩的假期可是越来越少了，劳动节之后就是感恩节，感恩节之后就是圣诞节，圣诞节之后就是元旦了，这一年就这么过去了。有的时候我们真是觉得啊，
不过昨天有一位网友晚上深夜很晚的时候在六道聊天区说啊，不能给李琦工作太重了啊，最近呢好像很疲劳的样子。我说李琦这一段时间整天在外面出差。好像有时候是今天好像凌晨6点钟才回家，
对，
早几年好像也是通宵在外面坐航班，
对，
过于疲劳，但是跟本公司的工作没有什么
基本没有什么关系，属于处理个人事务啊。或许哪一天咱们节目不忙的时候可以讲一讲。那我最近呢去了一次美国的南方，所感受到的这一种文化气氛的不同啊，那么和我们现在所处的纽约啊相比，的确是有很多，特别是在文化的多元性上面啊。有很多的不同，当然了，这是另外一个话题。这个劳累呢，和平先生其实比我还要劳累，为什么呢？因为他从早到晚呢一直在和 AI 战斗啊，处理 AI 出现的各种各样的问题。那么同时呢，也从 AI 获得各种各样的信息，有的时候呢也被 AI 误导，有的时候也给 AI 指导，与 AI 呢不断交叉互动。
对，他们说 AI 现在最大的问题就是错误。一本正经的给你犯下错误，
对，但是这个问题呢，很快也可能会有改善，因为现在啊，这个实时搜索正在不断的加入主流的 AI 驱动之中啊。那么特别呢是现在啊，这个 OpenAI 方面呢也开发了对于企业的我们叫做就是fine tuning， 就是对于模型的学习，比如说你希望它学习什么样的语料，那么可以通过企业来训练你所谓的这样的一个 AI 模型，可以说是定制化的这样的一个企业机器人啊。那么在这一方面呢，我们的这个研究团队和技术团队也在呢不断的研究，或许呢在稍后的一段时间就可以拿出产品给大家看。但近期其实我们 AI 驱动的一系列产品的这个流量所展示出的这样的一个涨势还是非常惊人的。那我们技术团队的一位同事昨天呢还在跟我们惊叹说的确，现在看到六度世界上最开始这些 AI 产生的内容，有很多网友开始觉得很反感，但实际上现在这一部分内容变成了整个平台上最受欢迎的一部分内容。当然了，刚才和明先生提点的也很对，怎样解决这一些 AI 它可能会出现我们叫做 hallucination 叫做幻象或者呢就是痴迷论语这样的一个情况，还是我们希望解决的下一个挑战。今天先不说 AI 有关的问题，先来聊一聊眼下中国经济大家最热门的话题。正如刚才在华尔街论坛中我们向大家所介绍的，今天着重要为大家介绍的是彭博商业周刊和纽约时报有关于中国经济问题的最新报道。彭博商业周刊有一篇题为 Meltdown 的这样的一篇长文那我们请导播把这一篇文章的封面向大家展示一下。我们可以看到在封面上有这样的一个人， 手里呢是捧着一栋房子的模型，这个人也许就是习近平。哎，仔细一看，手里其实并不是一个房子，而似乎是一座正在化掉的冰激凌样子的这样的一个蛋糕。习近平手中的蛋糕正在化掉，蛋糕都化了，你还怎么做蛋糕和切蛋糕啊？中国的房地产行业到底出现了什么样的问题呢？这就是彭博商业周刊这一篇封面报道所探讨的焦点。在3年前，中国开始了对于本国房地产行业的一系列监管打压，当时这是习近平共同富裕政策的一部分。为什么要这么做呢？因为需要人们更买得起房子，认为中国房地产市场的发展已经到了一个过渡，中国的房价可能已经不可持续。但是现在来看，中国的监管手段可能太过激烈、太过分了。近期碧桂园的迹象表明，情况可能还在急剧恶化。不仅仅是大型的负债累累的开发商，比如恒大，更多的优质开发商也濒临破产，而小城市的房价现在已经出现了崩溃。现在对于中国房地产危机蔓延的担忧，已经扩散到整个国家60万亿美元的金融体系。这个月影子银行中融国际信托有限公司出现的问题，更是引起了大家的警觉。房地产的繁荣和萧条在各国往往都非常的极端。那么美国2008年的次贷危机，大家更是记忆犹新。但是这样的情况在中国尤甚，房地产行业与经济的关系实在太过紧密，而对于家庭储蓄和信心的影响更是十分强烈。很多年来中国是由债务推动了房地产的繁荣。可以说这一种债务繁荣，一方面是支持了世界上最大的经济发展奇迹之一，但同时这样的一个繁荣从最开始就注定是不可持续的。而现在这样的一个房地产海市蜃楼瓦解的速度也是让人惊觉的。来自彭博社的报道介绍到，其实呢，从很多方面来看，当前房地产市场面临的可能崩溃，就是自己制造的一场危机。到底危机是如何产生的？我们知道，90年代的时候中国实施了房地产的私有化，这可以说是创造了中国近代史上最大规模的一次财富转移。很多企业家们是抓住这个机会，向银行进行大量借贷，而这样的一股借贷热潮，又为地方政府、全球债券投资者以及中国中产阶级注入了活力。房地产在整个中国经济中就发挥了巨大的作用。据来自彭博商业周刊的报道，顶峰时期，房地产行业直接间接已经占到国内产出的1/4，占到家庭资产的80%。如果算上现房和新房，再加上库存，2019年这个行业的价值是52万亿美元，与美国房地产市场规模相比怎样呢？已经达到了美国房地产市场规模的2倍。但是房地产市场的突飞猛进也给中国带来了巨大的社会分配和不均的问题。这样的房地产的市场使得年轻一代，特别是没有家庭财富继承的一代，难以承受一般的房价，而这也对于习近平减少贫富差距的努力构成了极大的挑战。在2020年底的时候，恒大引发了流动性恐慌，监管部门继续收紧，再加上之后疫情几年对于整个中国经济的重创，包括恒大融创这样的开发商纷纷都出现了违约。特别重要的是，中国这一些房地产巨头融资的主要来源是全球的债券持有者，现在这一些国际债券持有者已经被惊人的违约率吓坏了，融资成本一路走高，最终2000亿美元的房地产债券市场一度是全球高收益美元债务，也就是一般我们说的垃圾债市场，最赚钱的这一笔交易几乎是在一夜之间就消失殆尽了。中国开发商总共发行了大概将近500种美元债券，根据来自彭博社汇编的数据，现在有1/3都违约了，包括太平洋投资管理、富达国际等等，有600亿美元的债务现在还没有开始偿还，违约潮很有可能还刚刚开始。现在尽管对于碧桂园这样的优质企业，政府是表达了某一种支持的态度，但是看来看去救助意愿始终是不强。碧桂园一度曾经是中国销售额最大的开发商，38家公开交易的国有房地产公司中，今年几乎有一半上半年都出现了亏损。 另外呀，在正规银行体系之外，把资金注入房地产的影子银行，又是另外一重担忧。其中最典型的一个就是中融。中融啊是支持过很多的开发商，压住大流行之后，中国迅速反弹，结果中融2次赌注基本都失败了。现在中融的大股东正在重组债务，包括欠投资产品个人买家数十亿美元，现在不知道到底是不是会打水漂。而有关于中融的问题，如果大家关注到今天早些时候来自彭博社的报道，那么中央有关部门已经指示对于中融的问题进行清查，避免出现系统性的蔓延。根据来自彭博社汇编的数据，不良贷款率如果从2022年增加2倍的话，那么中国10家最大的贷款机构可能明年房地产不良贷款率就会产生到1200亿美元。比不良贷款更让人担忧的是房价的下跌，因为这与中国人的财富缩水息息相关。过去啊，有一些地方的房价跌幅已经达到了15%，甚至是20%。一方面呢，房价下跌，大家不是买房子更容易了吗？这仅仅是一方面，但是对于消费者信心的打压是另外一方面。中国的房地产价格多年以来一直是只升不降，而很多中国消费者是把房地产视为只赚不赔的投资，因此有很多人买了很多套公寓，希望能够从房价的涨势中获利，其中有一些人还是借钱买房。结果现在过去借钱买的房地产价值越来越低了，抵押贷款可是按照原来的价格继续借意，这就给可支付性带来了极大的问题。现在再加上青年失业率的一路上升，连锁反应已经引起了华尔街银行的警惕。在今年早几个月，我们在华尔街晚报节目中向您介绍，各大机构是纷纷下调了中国今年的 GDP 有关增长的预计。资产价格出现下跌，股票、债券继续走低，货币交易量更是接近了16年的低点。中国经济是不是真的出了问题？我们看到中国政府目前呢正在对房地产行业进行边际性的微调，一方面是避免全面救市，避免放水，但是同时啊也推出了一系列补救的措施，让充裕的现金流可以重新流向底盘比较强健的开发商，很多呢也是国有开发商。在去年啊，实际上有关于中国房地产的危机差一点就衍生成为某一种社会矛盾。如果大家看到社交媒体上的一些画面，可能还记得有数十万房主当时抵制按揭贷款啊，那么呢是抗议拖延之后啊，官方啊也不断的在推动之前一路停工的项目必须要立刻完工，保交房等等等等。在今年8月初，央行是意外下调了关键利率，希望能够提供一些刺激。而在本月早些时候，中国也放宽了购房限制，放宽了现有的抵押贷款条款，放宽了一些支付首付比例等等等等，这呢似乎对于房地产市场呢是带来了比较良性的信号。但是根本的问题是，很多的私营开发商没有得到及时的政府救助，国有的开发商仍然面临严峻的债务问题。中国的房地产行业可能很难回到以前了，未来几年可能还会出现一次大洗牌和大换血。现在又有人口的迅速老龄化的问题，城市化的高峰也已经结束了，房地产过剩的库存可能还需要数年甚至是10数年的时间才可以被消化。那么在这样的一个情况下呢，私营企业的负债可能会面临注销，而国有企业未来可能在整个房地产市场上占据更大的份额。比较乐观的经济学家估计，中国呀可能会在未来的10几年经过漫长艰苦的转型，过渡到一种更加良性的、不那么依赖房地产的经济形态。但是这个过程啊，很有可能是挫折重重，会带来各种各样的金融不稳定，以及经济以及社会的混乱。而现在以这个经济增长啊取代房地产为经济来源这样的一个庞大的中产阶级阶层，现在呢对于整个房地产市场的不安和不满，再叠加他们对于现在中国政治气氛的一种不安，也为执政的中国共产党带来了非常严峻的挑战。这就是彭博社的这一篇文章向我们透露的主要信息。那么这就向我们提出了一个问题， 在封面的这一张图片上啊，看到整个中国的房地产市场是正在融化，房地产市场占到了整个中国经济蛋糕的1/4，甚至更多。房地产市场到底对于整个蛋糕的其他部分有多大的影响？这可能是我们真正需要了解到的一个问题。那我想请问一下何明先生啊，房地产市场过去几十年在中国人生活、中国人财富中占到了这么重要、举足轻重的地位，现在房地产市场一轮洗牌可能在所难免。你认为经过调整后的中国房地产市场是以什么样的形态出现？中国是不是能够经过漫长痛苦的调整，让中国的经济走向更良性的生态？是不是会像彭博社这一篇文章所预计的这样，整顿过的房地产市场可能继续向国有集中，更多的私营可能会在这样的一个过程中出现清场、清退，甚至呢是直接面临结算、破产这样的一个情况？
首先我告诉你，结论肯定是乐观的啊，但是这个乐观什么时候出现？是10年还是5年？把这个房地产啊这么一个巨大的盘给清理清楚，我估计没有人有绝对的这个把握。但是清理啊，这种会走向一个比较良性的一种状况是几乎是必然的，因为房地产的问题不是在今天突然出现的一个所谓的暴雷，对于某家公司来讲，它可能是暴雷，但是对于整个房地产的危机来讲，中国人可能在15年以前，甚至更早一点时间就有了这种担忧啊，其实投资者也有担忧啊，开发商也有担忧，买房子的人也是担忧。但是这个市场啊，它就是这样的啊，明明知道有一天可能会出现问题，但是每一个人都认为呢，这个事情还在继续涨。这就是出现了一个经济学上的哪一个地方要建一个再高的大楼，这个地方可能房地产就会出现问题，因为人们的投资的心态都是跟对一个热潮来进行的。我没有经过中国的这个房地产的这么一个致富的这个过程，但是我经历过中国房地产最开始的变革的实际的这个理由。出来之后在90年代的时候我就看了一下资料讲到澳大利亚的房地产，如果是讲澳大利亚的商人比重来讲，房地产商在富人里面是占了相当大的这个比例，但是在90年代初期，澳大利亚的房地产突然这个崩溃，华人的投资者在里面受到的伤害是非常之大，其中有一位就是非常著名的福星小姐。福星小姐就是胡文虎的这个后代就是在缅甸的华商，后来办了一系列的这个报纸，有英文报纸《虎报》，有中文报纸《星岛集团》但是当时候呢，他们押宝在这个澳大利亚的房地产，结果在90年代初期的时候就是这个可以说是大崩盘。那个时候很多的华商要受到伤害，但是今天澳大利亚的房地产在后来的几十年中间还是这种慢慢理顺了。比如我们再来讲这个加拿大我最近看了加拿大的新闻，因为很多优秀的人才尤其是华人的学者华人的这些博士生或者是中国的中产阶级都把加拿大作为一个非常理想的一个目的地。但是加拿大最近传了一个消息说国际学生的签证也要暂时放缓，原因很简单，住房紧张了房子非常紧张，学生终于找不到房子。加拿大最大的一个特点就是地域非常宽阔建房子很容易，但是他也经历过一个非常痛苦的这个阶段。在80年代末期和90年代初期，一个80平方米到这个100平的一个房子大概是多少加元呢？2万多块钱。2万多块钱，现在40万还是50万还是100万，我不知道。但是我知道那个时候2万块钱我都拿不出来，拿得出来的话，也许我今天就不需要住到这个地方了当时很多的朋友没有胆量去买那个房子。那美国我们也经过了那样一个真的是现在都不敢回想的2008年的次贷危机，跟多少人的美国梦一夜之间就粉碎了，而且不但是粉碎了，无数的银行也拖了在其中。而在这个时候，美国政府出手了。如果美国政府不出手不去清理这些不良资产，甚至接手这个不良资产，也许那些民间企业家的他的承受能力就更弱造成市场的冲击就更大。今天中国的国有开发商或者是国有企业或者进去是不是一个好的时机？是不是又增加大陆现在对这个经济发展模式的一个疑惑？或者是这些房地产拿到手里 到底干什么？什么时候这个房地产再回到一个应有的一个市场面？现在谁都不知道，谁都不知道。但是我觉得中国政府在处理房地产的这个事情的时候啊，它有一些政策啊，最开始是3条红线，我们认为过于的刚性。但是以中国人的这种狡猾的程度啊，有人说，如果你不搞刚性了，你就变成这个线就不存在了。但是这个刚性造成的这个市场的打击，不仅是房地产本身对投资者的信心，对这个买房子的人的这种情绪那么包括开发商的周延的各种企业、各种生态都受到了相应的这个破坏。但是这种破坏呢，由于是中国政府是采取一种比较主动的方式，也就是说对这些危机和存在的问题，他们是有一些他们的步骤的。我相信而不是像西方这样，更多的是一种市场反应，真正爆雷之后政府才能接手。问题其实是呢，政府出手的比较更晚一点。中国政府也许从时间来讲也是晚了一点，但是从最近几年的做法来讲，他们是有备而来，而不是说惊慌失措。所以呢，这个从新闻的角度来讲，从大家的感受来讲，到时候当然是非常的焦虑，非常的不看好。但是从长期的发展来讲，我认为这是必须经过的一个痛苦的调整，而且会在这个痛苦的调整中呢走出来。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍。刚才何明先生其实强调了很重要的一点，就是说有的时候制造这个问题本身和解决这个问题本身，其实中国政府似乎都显示出了更加出色的能力
对。
那么就说这个2008年之后，实际上制造起这个巨大的房地产泡沫，也是当时现在回头看并不负责任的房地产政策以及财政政策但是当然了，现在解决中国的这个房地产问题中国政府也有一些外界有的时候呢往往忽视的一些优势条件。这一点我们在节目中也为大家分析过，比如整个中国的债务组成，包括地方政府的负债问题虽然很严重，但是整个中央政府的资产负债表还是相当的稳健的。再比如中国的债务主要是在国内债权人为主那么呢国际投资者这一边能够对中国市场造成的冲击是相对较小的。之前呢，我们在思想先驱报中也为大家分析过这样的有关的情况。今天呢，要为大家介绍的，除了房地产市场的有关消息之外就有一个近期我们特别关注到的话题，就是中国的就业问题。一提到中国的就业问题近期我也问了一些在中国刚刚回来，或者呢是现在人就在中国的一些各行各业的人士，他们其实跟我描述的情形也是七嘴八舌、五花八门莫衷一是。有的人呢就觉得情况非常的不好，有的人觉得好像没有什么感觉，特别是有一些顶尖院校毕业的学生，觉得找工作好像跟往年也没有什么特别不同的。那么情况到底是怎样的呢？如果看到中国官方媒体的报道那么中国官方媒体始终强调的是困难是暂时的。尽管现在出现了一些悲观和气馁情绪，中国官方媒体还说说现在有关于中国经济的问题完全是西方政客和媒体与中国的认知争夺战。很多的官方媒体喉舌在近期都放出了这样的消息，比如央视支持的一个社交媒体账号还发布视频其中分析外国媒体是如何故意筛选预测中国经济更高的数字，然后之后又唱衰中国等等等等。那么中国官方媒体还说这一些媒体最终是难逃被现实打脸的命运。而同样的话在中国外交部发言人口中也不断的重复。那我们也知道中国的这个数据近期呢是不断的走黑，就像北京本月停止公布青年失业率一样。这对于新闻研究者、新闻从业者而言呢，可以说是一个莫大的讽刺。过去有数据你还可以质疑这个数据的真假，现在你干脆不发布了，那大家只能往最坏的地方来想。审查机器对于官方叙事进行了严格的控制，现实状况到底与官方叙事是不是一致呢？纽约时报的记者可以说非常的让人敬佩，因为他们为了了解中国的情况，还真的是走访了很多中国大大小小的阶层，从精英阶层到工厂工人，结果发现不管真实的经济情况到底如何，公众的悲观情绪实际上还是相当的普遍的。之前呢，我们为大家介绍了中国的房地产问题，房地产危机可以说让很多的中国中产阶级陷入困境。而除了房地产领域之外，不管是教育还是科技，政府对于各大白领行业的打压，也引发了很多大公司的裁员潮，外企停止在华投资，很多工厂也出现了订单减少、工人工资下跌、消费者需求萎靡的情况。纽约时报就采访到了一位从大学返乡的学生， 他说呀，我试了好几次，就是没有找到理想的工作，要么是工资太低，要么是工厂根本不要我，所以现在呀就有这么一点摆烂的感觉了。这一位年轻人向《纽约时报》探到啊，说现在呀我就在父母经营的五金店里面打一打手游没有办法，只能的是先闲下来。中国的社交媒体上也可以看到一些零星的对于中国经济状况的评论，但是对于中国经济持怀疑或者直白评论态度的很多账号，要么是被禁言，要么是被封号了，受到了严格的限制。在8月，在武汉参与招聘的大学生有很多，就像大家在屏幕上所看到的这样。那么来自《纽约时报》的报道一直在介绍，这些大学生在找工作的时候也发现，明明是过去有的工作，今年似乎机会却越来越少。平时服务行业是吸纳大学生的重要途道，但是由于疫情的封锁，很多服务业，特别是中小微企业，在过去的几年里也面临倒闭，或者呢是干脆就关张走人这样的命运，雇主自然就少了。纽约时报还采访到了一位城市中产阶级，他说呀，过去有一点钱还可以买房投资，现在房地产市场这个样子，谁也不敢去买房，谁也不敢轻易去买大件。纽约时报还采访到了街头一位饺子店的老板和老板娘，他们也说说原本是没打算创业的，去年的时候还在一家汽车厂工作，每月呢大概挣到7、8千块钱这样，在上海大概属于月工资的平均水平。结果到了今年春天，工资就降了，虽然没有丢掉工作，工资降掉了多少呢？降到了3000多、4000多左右。结果这个价钱实在是没有办法，夫妇俩干脆觉得也不能在这个汽修店继续干了，就决定自己开店。结果把毕生攒下的10几万、20几万块钱，毕生积蓄都投入到了开店的中，希望能够看到一些热闹非凡的小餐饮店可以在疫情之后重新启动。结果他说，现在发现呢，我们想开店这个梦想也很艰难，这儿的生意也不好。疫情前大家总是想出来买一点什么，而现在他们看着自己10几岁的儿子无精打采的在店里的一张空桌片玩游戏，也说现在的人连水果都不买了，基本只买主食和蔬菜。我们当时还认为只要大家熬过这几年就肯定有希望，结果疫情一结束反而更糟糕了。中国的官方也直接回应了中国经济的一些问题，承认中国经济面临挑战，认为呢复苏是波浪式的复苏，但是中国官方始终强调整体还是前景乐观的。经济学家对于这样的说法普遍是持怀疑的，特别是政府现在拒绝向家庭直接发放现金，政府在购买新房提供税收优惠的同时，对于本来就已经相当薄弱的社会保障体系，其实还在继续的削弱。在周一的时候，大家可能还记得中国的财政部门把股票交易税减半了，但是这呢只是把现有的交易的成本降低了，并不能够改变大家不愿意投资股票的想法，因为现在企业情况不好，大家对于股票增值本来就缺乏信心。有一些城市中产阶级也直言不讳地对《纽约时报》的记者说，很多高层领导和中国人对于现实的感受之间是明显脱节的。的确，政府把经济放缓归咎于外部因素，在当地也有人支持这样的说法，有人就谈到了中美贸易战，谈到了限制对于中国的计算机芯片出口的有关新闻报道。但是大家往往心里也有这样的一个想法，就是我们现在出现的问题也不完全是美国人造我们的谣，也不完全是西方对于我们的封锁，我们自己的经济状况也有我们自己的问题，而这一点在官方的叙述中很少看到检讨和反思。同时，《纽约时报》的记者也观察到，这一种经济上的伤感和痛苦在全国各地的分布是不均匀的，很多的富裕阶层受到这样不安因素的打击就比较小，很多富裕阶层现在还可以重新购买奢侈品，比如你去一些高档的名牌购物中心还是非常热闹的。但是对于大多数普通的中国人来说，他们没有办法去这样奢华品店继续购买了，很多人减少了支出，即使是选择出外旅游，原来可能是去欧洲、日本，现在也选择比较便宜的目的地了。在收入比较低的中国人中，这一种低迷的悲观情绪就更加普遍了。 到底谁应该为经济痛苦负责？很多中国人觉得呀，这并不是最关键的问题，大家更期待看到的是这样的情况到底什么时候才可以有逆转？上海是人向往的地方，人口量啊是不断的在膨胀。在当地上海，《纽约时报》采访到了这样的一位外来务工的安徽人，他说现在啊，上海是人口不断的在膨胀，大家越来越多的往上海涌，因为周边的这样的一个机会越来越少了。上海是热闹了，但实际上情势却不是那么乐观。官方对于经济形势的解释也很难让人信服。《纽约时报》啊也说采访到了一些开小店的老板，他们说呀，现在干脆不看经济新闻了，看来看去都是让人伤感。花了很多时间来看看像小红书啊这样的中国本土的社交媒体，与其担忧国家大事，还不如看一看现在到底怎样开店，学一学开店的窍门，学一学营销的秘籍。但是即使是在小红书上，很多的帖子啊也是在哀叹自己的这个小本生意本来挣钱就不多，现在生意是更加的糟糕了。这就是《纽约时报》这一篇文章啊向我们展示的有关的情况。首先必须要说《纽约时报》的记者走访了这么多地方，采访了这么多人，这样的一种可以说是实地探访的态度，还是非常让我们敬佩的。《纽约时报》的报道呢，其实也展示了中国各个阶层面对现在中国经济状况产生的不同的情绪。其中也讲到，如果你是城市的富裕中产阶级，那么可能对你来讲，现在中国的这样的一个经济环境啊，对你现实的生活压力感觉并不大，你该买奢侈品还是去买。疫情期间没有去的地方，现在更能够出游了。似乎经济的痛苦并不直接为你所感受到。但是如果你是一个2、3线城市，如果你是一个本来家里经济状况就不好的应届大学生，那么现在的情况可能就要糟糕很多了。其中让我印象最深的就是在疫情前，其实在上海的工厂里面有相当优渥工作的一对夫妇，他们虽然是没有丢掉工作，结果发现自己的工资直接被折半了，折半的工资根本没有办法养活一家的生活。于是一对夫妇铤而走险，用一生的积蓄开了一家饺子店，认为疫情期间大家没有办法出来吃餐厅那么疫情开放之后，餐厅的生意应该好。结果这个赌注错了，大家不但是没有那么多人出来吃小馆子，甚至是连买水果的人都变少了，看上去也很难让人不为他们的命运哀叹那么读过这样的一篇文章我们也了解到了中国普通人的一些故事。当然了，我们也说《纽约时报》采访的这一些人其实也只是中国的一部分，可能也有很多的人，特别是中国的真正的一些佼佼者，中国的真正的一些投资人，他们在疫情之后看到的是中国未来更多的机会，看到的是还未发展起来的新兴产业，未来可能会出现突飞猛进的势头，就看你从哪个角度来进行观察。但是我觉得《纽约时报》这一篇文章也特别讲出了一点，就是现在中国官方媒体的叙事过多的强调经济形势好，现在的痛苦是暂时的，但是似乎又没有给这一些生活在中国的民众，对于未来感到不安的中国民众一个真实的信心的所向。你不能说今天经济不好，过几天咱们就好了，到底是过几天呢？你到底有什么办法让经济更好中国官方媒体还让人觉得失望的一点，就是把所有对于中国经济问题的批评，对于疫情封锁，对于监管政策不当的批评，全部归结成是西方媒体唱衰中国。这在我看来也是比较不负责任的一种做法。那么到底怎样给中国经济打气呢？何明先生你怎么看？
中国的这个宣传媒体我们可能已经讲了10000次了就是制造怨恨制造了人们对政府的不信任，制造了对习近平的这种责难主要是中国官方媒体现在的主要的功能因为他们呢完全把老百姓变成一个文革时候的那种所谓的愚昧的老百姓只知道毛主席万岁万岁万万岁今天的中国人不要说可以翻墙了，他就算是不翻墙在中国社会中间，他的亲身的体会今天的生活的艰难，转型的艰难商场各等状况，大家应该看得很清楚。你这个官方媒体固然要鼓励大家这个心情，这个没有错， 但是你把这个今天的经济的出现的问题简单的归根于西方媒体，那你对中国有什么影响啊？你《纽约时报》登一篇文章对中国的具体情况有什么影响吗？顶多不过是影响几个投资者或者政客而已，对今天的中国老百姓一点影响都没有啊，一点影响都没有。所以中国媒体的这种官方媒体的这种可耻，而且是如此的低劣啊！我觉得我一直主张就是说，中国的大外宣应该彻底废除，中国的大内宣也应该彻底废除，而不如呢不要这些媒体，因为这些媒体会大大的增加人们对政府和对未来的没有这个信心。再回头来啊，我们应该像《纽约时报》这种非常辛苦的实地的这个采访来拼凑这么一个故事出来。真的是很不容易，要尽可能的反映中国社会各个阶层的这些变化，就访问这些人，这些记者真的是了不起。我一直是觉得呢，中国政府啊搞这个大外宣，还不如呢善待啊西方的记者，让西方的记者在中国的各个阶层去走一走。看到今天的中国人的生活，并不像啊那些危险论的人讲啊，中国就会对西方马上有非常巨大的挑战。中国整体来讲是已形成了某一种挑战，价值观呀、经济实力呀、军事啊等等方面。但是实际上，中国存在的问题之多啊，多长时间才能让整体的中国人过上一个北欧、西欧啊，甚至美国这样的日子？其实我们普通中国人都明白啊，差得很远很远。中国的问题就是呢过于的政治意识形态化的呢解释今天中国的经济问题。今天中国的经济问题，地缘政治、美国的打压，其实只是占里面的分量的非常小的部分。就好像习近平的粗暴政策也不是关键性的因素，真正关键性的因素是30年这样一等高速的经济增长还没有把市场秩序给建立起来，还没有把法治建立起来。那即算是有了秩序和法律系统，你这个经济它是不能说有一定的周期力吧，当它自由的高速增长之后，它积累的问题它就是需要一段时间化解。美国是每10年来一次，对吧？或者每几年来一次。那其他国家情况我不是那么了解。中国在30年来进行一次调整，那其实是大家应该正常面对的。何况现在面临的一个产业的一个调整，整个生态的一个调整。昨天我们一位年轻的这个学者跑过来这个见李琦也是我曾经的当年的老朋友的一个学生我们在一起喝咖啡的时候聊到，我说我从80年代去香港每一次坐计程车没有一次计程车司机告诉我说现在日子很好过，没有。在英国殖民地的时候不好过，97孤独不好过今天就更不好过但是这位这个年轻的这个学者，我们的网友就说他说现在真的是很惨。你说这个中法这个地方这么黄金的地大这个控制力有20%多。李杰博士们就说，他说曼哈顿的市中心是50%如果同样的记者你跑到美国来，就跑到我们的镇上去看一看，你就会描绘一出美国今天的中上业者的那种艰辛，你无法想象就是一个一个的店铺的倒闭一个一个的整个街甚至可以说像世界末日的感觉。你就不知道怎么在这个地方还有这样的商店你怎么这样的地方就完全就没人了，人到哪去了？而且还就在相当经济繁荣的纽约的郊区。那你更不用说我们去宾州我们去新泽西我们去这个康州那样的富裕的地方。为什么？因为有一些产业的调整是全球化都在发生的。如果你到美国了解的历史就知道了，美国有一些偏僻的一些地方曾经是很繁华的，是因为他修了这个铁路带来了繁荣，结果呢修了公路这个铁路那个地方又不繁荣了，然后原来的军工业原来的煤炭业非常繁荣，带来了很多的商店。我们知道香山悲歌嘛，那我不知道欧洲的这个情况我去过欧洲一些地方，其实大体上也差不多，整个的产业在变化。原来我们中国有一句老话嘛，有一个店铺养3代，反对了大家打酱油，对不对？你只要跟他关系处理的好，这个店老板跟人际关系不错 错，你基本上在这个区域里面，人们就靠它生活。你看，你也靠大家呢来做这个生意啊，来养活自己，能成为呢奠定一个长期和稳定的阶层。但是你现在不大可能了。不大可能了，我就想哪一天来描述一下我的工作的周围的这个环境的变化、餐馆的变化、超级市场的变化、各种店铺的变化，你就可以发现那种更新的速度之快啊！有的店你还没有开到几个月，对吧？一怀疑生意不行了，就只能关掉啊，对吧？以前这种情况是非常少的发生，所以同样的记者，如果你跑到美国来，你也可以看到美国的这些层面，但是这是美国的前部吗？你去看看新泽西啊那些生物公司，对吧？你去看看啊康州那些富裕的这个民众啊，你去看看这个波士顿的那些高科技，你就会发现另外一个场景。今天的中国，咱们也要接受一种多层次的中国正在出现。有一些人是很艰难，有的人是政府的粗暴的政策所造成的，有一些是自己跟不上形势，有一些是产业的调整。但这不是中国的前部，所以记者他有时候看到的场景是真实的，老百姓讲出来的这个怨恨或者是失望式的沮丧呢，也是真实的。但是你要对中国的前景做出一个判断的话，光只是一个现场的场景是远远不够的。中国的经济的判断，它需要故事，需要鲜活的这种人来讲故事给我们听。但是它不是中国的前部啊！我对中国的这经济啊，在面对到西方的这种爬山倒海式的这种对中国的这种负面的评价，我非常不以为然啊！这种不以为然也无所谓，反正是西方他们在判断世界局势的时候没几次真正对过啊！对中国的情况几乎就都是这样的啊！从这个上个世纪的抗战开始啊，西方就有一套他们自以为是的这个眼光，也有他们非常专业的眼光。但是我觉得作为一个中国人，就看看西方人怎么去看待中国，我是非常乐于看待，哪怕是他们讲的这些问题和缺点，对吧？但是你要看多了以后，你也就知道西方媒体它有它巨大的这个缺陷，它总是喜欢讲故事作为媒体来讲，他知道读者不太懂的所以要讲一个故事给你听。所以为了这个故事讲这个故事是西方媒体的一个主要的一个方式。第二个是西方媒体是跟风原来我认为西方媒体应该是有个性的，其实呢，西方媒体的个性也是很艰难的，因为大众的人接受的程度是比较低的。你真正要讲出一些比较深刻的东西，美国很多智库有报告，那等流量、那等观看量简直低的你无法想象对吧？因为民众一般都是喜欢讲故事，故事有时候即算是真实的，也未必是这个世界上的真实的本身。所以对待中国的这个经济问题并不像西方媒体泄露的好像中国要崩溃了，中国要完了，更不像中国官方这样的这样一个好像光明就在前面。我不认为中国在未来几十年会那么的光明，那么的顺畅。中美关系的进程只是其中一个元素，关键的是中国这么大，人口的老化、产业结构的调整、中国人的观念，很多的因素，中国人要达到一个文明的标准，还是有漫长的这个路程。但是以中国人的勤奋聪明和中国人的分量，以中国人在科技产业方面的早就已经呢有这种对科学的敬畏之心，在科学技术方面的这个创新的能力不仅仅是在这个应用科学在这个基础科学方面中国也不仅是一些论文在真正的实际中间，中国人即使是有一些成就，可能是被西方媒体所忽视，也许是有一天我们突然爆发出来就会发现中国人在某些方面还是可以的。所以面对今天的中国的问题，我觉得如果真正从平衡和真实的角度来讲，其实各个层面的情况都有都不一定说是谎言，但是基本上它不是全部。
好，谢谢和平先生的点评那不知道今天这两篇文章，一篇呢是讲的中国房地产市场的问题，另外一篇呢是讲到中国现在失业的问题，是不是帮助大家了解中国的情况，更能够提供一些不同的思考和角度感谢给我们打赏支持的观众朋友们。刚才和平先生特别说，智库有关的报告，在明天的思想先驱报中我们就会看一篇 发表在外交事务上的来自于智库研究者的报告，讲的也是我们观众朋友们非常关心的一个问题：中国、美国之间的意识形态之争到底争的是什么？是一个是共产主义，一个是资本主义，还是其他的一些什么？这一种意识形态之争是不是不可调和的？是不是真正意义上的你死我活、水火不容？在明天思想先驱报，我们会继续为您带来这一篇文章。感谢给我们打赏支持的观众朋友们，感谢如是我们，感谢麦团，感谢杨天，感谢艺人，谢谢各位观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天思想先驱报与各位不见不散。
America's increasingly hardline China policy is probably 80% right on its specific components, given Beijing's assertiveness of recent years, but it is at risk of going too far in its tone and temperature. While staying focused on the challenges posed by China's rise, it is crucial that we keep our strategic composure and sense of perspective on the nature of the problem. America is capable of groupthink, as we arguably saw, for example, in the Vietnam War and in the prelude to the Iraq invasion of 2003. We need to avoid the temptation to unify so strongly around the China threat paradigm that we unwittingly increase the risks of confrontation ourselves. That could happen if Washington inadvertently signaled support for Taiwan's de jure independence and a willingness to fight China on its behalf upon such a declaration. It could also happen if the United States overreacted to a relatively minor and non-lethal incident in the South China Sea or East China Sea, or if the two countries demonized each other to the point that communications between them were largely cut off even when badly needed during a future crisis. Whether it is China's record on the use of force, its stated and revealed aspirations for expanded global influence in the future, or its ongoing military buildups, Beijing poses real challenges to American strategic interests. But the situation, while potentially dangerous, is not dire. It is not comparable to Adolf Hitler's rise in the 1930s, or Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong's ambitions of the 1940s and 1950s, and despite the injudicious use of this term by seasoned foreign policy experts in a recent influential article, China does not, together with Russia and Iran, constitute a new axis of evil. For example, while growing fast, China's military budget totals 1/3 of America's, roughly speaking, and only about half as high a fraction of the nation's gross domestic product, and China has not fought a war since 1979. Vigilance is needed, resoluteness is required, pushback is essential. But so is calm, and a sense of proportionality. The United States is doing a generally good job in standing up to a rising China. Strong bipartisan consensus for an $858 billion U.S. national defense budget in 2023, exceeding peak levels of Cold War resources in inflation-adjusted terms, bodes well. So do recent bipartisan decisions to strengthen America's technological and industrial foundations in key sectors here at home through the CHIPS and Science Act, so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and Infrastructure Investment Act, as well as a generally more supportive approach to education in the STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in recent times. The United States and its allies are rightly using tools like the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to limit China's ability to acquire and exploit this and allied nations' high-tech jewels. American and allied militaries continue to conduct freedom of navigation exercises in the Western Pacific region even where China wrongly claims they should not. The United States rightly seeks to improve Taiwan's military capacities against possible Chinese attack, even if the pace of that effort often lags. But we may be on the verge of overdoing it if not in the specifics of our policy responses to China's rise, then in the overall mindset of how to handle the People's Republic of China, PRC. We risk taking actions that could help turn a rival into an adversary or even a military enemy. To be sure, China is not only a challenge but a potential danger, and its foreign policy behavior during the last decade has been particularly fraught. Its military capacities are already impressive enough that for many types of hypothetical conflicts pitting America and its allies against China, it is not clear which side would win, a reality that should concern civilian strategists and military planners alike. Thus, I agree with 80% to 90% of specific U.S. policies that focus on addressing that threat. But the last 10% to 20%, notionally speaking, may be on the verge of going too far. So does the framing rhetoric and language we now often collectively use to describe China. Such thinking could lead, for example, to excessively rapid escalation in a crisis, especially if we convince ourselves that China has a specific plan to attack Taiwan by a certain date this decade. It could also lead the United States, very dangerously, to abandon the one China policy that has helped prevent war over Taiwan for 4 decades. Much of this paper is written, accordingly, as a provocation, or at least an attempt at a corrective to the trend in current U.S. strategic thought. It is not my own effort to mimic the worldwide threat assessments that the Director of National Intelligence or Defense Intelligence Agency produce each winter. Instead, this is an interpretative essay about what we are getting right, and what we perhaps are not, in what is quickly becoming a new collective wisdom in the United States about the nature of the China threat in particular. The essay is my second of three over the 2022 to 2023 period that offer guidance for U.S. defense strategy as well as the defense budget. The first, also published by the Brookings Institution in 2022, was entitled, Can China Take Taiwan? Why No One Really Knows. It consisted largely of a detailed modeling of a potential Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan, followed by a U.S/Taiwan/Allied response. It reached the conclusion noted above, as stated in the title of the paper. For a number of types of possible U.S.-China engagements, it is unrealistic to think we can predict the winner. That is true, I believe, even assuming that policymakers prevent any such war from escalating geographically or vertically, example, to nuclear weapons employment. The conclusion, I find, is also relatively impervious to the specific size or cost of the U.S. defense establishment. Thus, when I argue that we should right-size and not overestimate the China threat, I do not mean to suggest that America enjoys an overwhelming military advantage against the PRC for all the kinds of contingencies that could pit the two countries against each other. Rather, I contend that the depiction of China as a fundamentally hostile and aggressive nation is often overdone in the contemporary American strategic debate. The final paper of my trilogy, to be published late in 2023, has the working title of $1 trillion for defense? Slightly too much of a good thing. It will provide specific suggestions on where and how economies, as well as necessary increases, can be made in the U.S. defense program of today. This paper attempts to lay the foundation for that final paper by analyzing the strategic environment in which defense policy and defense budgets are made. For some, the rise of China poses an inordinate risk to the global order. Graham Allison, a brilliant Harvard strategist and historian, has coined the phrase Thucydides' trap to underscore the risks when a rising power challenges an existing and established rival. It is worth remembering that, in the case of Greek city-states, it was a rising democracy, Athens, that was seen as threatening by an established and less democratic Sparta, a different dynamic than the one between China and the United States today. In the specific case of China, we face an autocratic regime brimming with confidence, a strong desire to bring Taiwan back under its rule, and substantial ambitions in the Western Pacific, broader Middle East, and beyond. China wields the world's largest manufacturing base, second largest economy by traditional exchange rate measures, largest economy when adjusted for purchasing power parity, and impressive technological capabilities including in crucial digital and cyber sectors. It now has the world's second largest population, next to India. Allison is right to warn in general terms about what such big changes have meant historically. But there is so much different about today's world, to repeat, the preponderance of democracies, despite recent setbacks, a far higher percentage of the world's population now lives in countries deemed free or partly free by Freedom House than at any time before the Cold War's end, the strength of the modern US-led alliance system, forward-stationed American military forces to undergird those alliances, nuclear deterrence, some aspects of globalization, to give considerable reason for hope. That past patterns in great power relations can be changed. Arguably, since 1945, they already have been, despite the partial backsliding in recent years. The Biden administration's national security strategy prioritizes China as the most consequential geopolitical challenge of the United States, and its national defense strategy designates the PRC as America's pacing challenge. These are reasonable terms. They have led the Biden team, like the Trump team before it, to increase defense spending, emphasize military innovation and modernization within the defense budget, seek to address national vulnerabilities in the cyber, space, and infrastructural domains, prioritize the Pacific region in national security terms, and undertake a number of key initiatives to that same end with major allies and partners. All of this is to the good. None of it was easy or automatic. None is guaranteed to endure unless we stay appropriately vigilant. There is vigorous debate in the United States over whether Beijing might see a window of opportunity to attack Taiwan by the late 2020s. The former head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip Davidson, has warned of that possibility. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had concluded by October of 2022 that China had become determined to pursue reunification on a much faster timeline. Chinese President Xi Jinping has told his military to be fully modernized and ready for all contingencies by 2027. Some strategists also believe that, in light of its demographic decline and other internal challenges that could get much worse by the 2030s, China may perceive itself to have a relatively narrow window of opportunity to take Taiwan in the late 2020s or so. It is true that China faces long-term economic and environmental challenges that are quite significant. By 2050, it will have 500 million individuals over 60 but only 700 million workers to provide for them. By 2100, given current predictions, its population may have declined from 1.4 billion to 800 million. Those trends may augur well for China in the 22nd century if it can stabilize its population sometime in that period, but in the shorter term, such demographics pose huge challenges to any government. But despite these challenges, I see little evidence that Chinese leaders lack confidence in their country's long-term future. And as for Xi's promulgation of a 2027 deadline for modernization, his language may be mostly hortatory. The idea that any military can ever complete a full modernization program by a certain date is never quite plausible. Military innovation is always ongoing and continuous in the real world. Thus, some scholars, while hardly downplaying the China threat, tend to view it as a more general and lasting problem as opposed to an acute challenge in a given window of time. The Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force has a similar view. I lean toward this latter interpretation myself, largely because China is in the business of issuing various kinds of 5-year, 10-year, and other plans, not all of which have specific military implications and not all of which are realistic. Notably, Beijing's Made in China 2025 plan, promulgated back in 2015, calls for China to be a leader in 10 high-tech sectors, including a number like robotics with major military relevance, by the year 2025. Other plans focus on 2030 or 2035, or aspire to major changes by the 100th anniversary of Chinese Communist Party rule in China in 2049. What about the Russian threat? We must not lose sight of that challenge, as General H.R. McMaster and Secretary of Defense James Mattis rightly underscored in the Trump administration's National Security Strategy of 2017 and National Defense Strategy of 2018. It is Russia, after all, that is laying waste to cities in Europe and issuing nuclear threats against the West even as these words are written. It is Russian President Vladimir Putin who seems to have a pathological hatred of all things Ukrainian, especially its admirable leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, and a contempt for the idea that there even should be such a thing as an independent Ukrainian nation. Ironically, Putin's aggressions against Ukraine may have done more to unify and cohere its people, and stoke their sense of distinctiveness as well as nationalism, than anything else in their history. And Putin continues to act on these sentiments, with little evidence that what is left of Russian democracy can exert any meaningful checks and balances on his behavior. Putin has also spent 2 decades building up resentment against the West over NATO and European Union expansion, the Kosovo War, American support for color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia in the early 2000s, American support for some of Putin's political opponents at home, and what Putin sees as unilateralist American blundering from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya after September 11th. Putin has spent recent years in Russia further marginalizing his internal critics and weakening, if not ending, his country's democracy. Alas, the history of leaders like Putin around the world hardly suggests that he will likely leave office soon or that his regime will be replaced by a more democratic and benign political system once gone. Some have described Russia as a regional power with nuclear weapons, as a giant gas station, or as some other such derogatory term. Although it is true that Russia's GDP is comparable to that of a mid-level Western European power, and that its scientific and technological capacity has atrophied, even before the sanctions of 2022, it is hardly to be trifled with. It is the world's top nuclear weapons state, the world's largest country in terms of landmass, the world's most geographically exposed and yet geographically menacing country, those two attributes being flip sides of the same coin, and a proud nation with a strong sense of national identity and global purpose. It has more than 3 times the population of Iraq or Afghanistan or Ukraine. Moreover, in its near abroad, it is highly motivated and reasonably powerful, a combination that Catherine Stoner convincingly argues gives it considerable power and influence in some key parts of Europe. All that said, I believe we have most of the makings of a successful Russia policy today. Supporting Ukraine strongly in its war effort, sustaining sanctions on Russia, and fortifying NATO's eastern flank provide the raw ingredients for a successful Russia policy in the months and years to come, provided we stay focused, vigilant, and united, and also creative as well as pragmatic in thinking through ways the war in Ukraine can eventually end. It will be entirely fair game if a GOP House of Representatives asks for more accountability and more answers to tough questions about the endgame for the war in Ukraine, as it considers future Biden administration requests for aid for Ukraine. But such questioning must not actually interrupt the flow of crucial assistance or smack of irresoluteness on our collective part. Provided we get that balance right and think creatively about that endgame in Ukraine, I believe America's Russia policy can succeed. Thus, I will spend more time below on China, where we do not yet have the paradigm quite right in my judgment. Whatever the most relevant time frame, and even in light of the importance of staying focused on the challenges posed by China's rise, I believe it is crucial that we keep our strategic composure and sense of perspective on the nature of the problem. America is capable of groupthink, as we arguably saw for example in the Vietnam War and in the prelude to the Iraq invasion of 2003. We need to avoid the temptation to unify so strongly around the China threat paradigm that we unwittingly increase the risks of confrontation ourselves. That could happen if Washington inadvertently signaled support for Taiwan's de jure independence and a willingness to fight China on its behalf upon such a declaration. It could also happen if the United States overreacted to a relatively minor and non-lethal incident in the South China Sea or East China Sea, or if the two countries demonized each other to the point that communications between them were largely cut off even when badly needed during a future crisis. Whether it is China's record on the use of force, its stated and revealed aspirations for expanded global influence in the future, or its ongoing military buildups, Beijing poses real challenges to American strategic interests. But the situation, while potentially dangerous, is not dire. It is not comparable to Adolf Hitler's rise in the 1930s, or Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong's ambitions of the 1940s and 1950s, and despite the injudicious use of this term by seasoned foreign policy experts in a recent influential article, China does not together with Russia and Iran constitute a new axis of evil. Consider the nature of the PRC's foreign policy. It is certainly concerning. China has, for example, been assertive and threatening in the South China Sea and East China Sea, and along its Himalayan border with India, where China did kill some Indian troops in recent years. However, while assertive, sometimes imprudent, and occasionally downright aggressive, China's behavior in the Western Pacific has generally stopped short of the sustained use of force. China is a country that has not gone to war since 1979. That fact should count for something. Even on law of the sea matters, where China's behavior is unsettling, there is nuance in the situation. Even India does not share Washington's view about so-called freedom of navigation operations. New Delhi believes that any country wishing to traverse not just the territorial seas, but in fact, the exclusive economic zones, generally extending out 200 nautical miles from the coastline, of another nation should request permission for such transit in advance. China, of course, agrees. The United States should continue to operate its naval forces freely in the South China Sea. But it should not, to my mind, be too surprised that China finds such operations off-putting. The broader debate should also bear in mind that, by Washington's reckoning, dozens of countries commit infractions of customary law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the United States itself, not having ratified the latter, is on shaky legal ground too in regard to this whole subject. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, in 2021, American friends and allies to include Italy, Japan, South Korea, and Costa Rica were among the perpetrators. To be sure, China's assertiveness puts it in a separate category from most others. But the existence of a disagreement between Washington and Beijing over maritime rights does not itself prove that China seeks to overturn the entirety or foundation of the rules-based order. More accurately, I believe, it is trying to modify that order in specific ways to suit its own interests. The United States and its allies have the tools to handle much of what China does that we do not like. Point 1. Ongoing commitment to a forward presence in international airways and sea lanes. Point 2. Institutional vehicles like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, with Japan, India, and Australia, as well as the new AUKUS arrangement, with Australia and the United Kingdom. Point 3. The continued refinement of integrated deterrence as an instrument of U.S. and allied security policy that promises economic punishment and military realignments in response to low-grade Chinese aggression. I do not see integrated deterrence, a concept I helped formulate in my 2019 book, The Senkaku Paradox, and that combines the threat of economic warfare, among other things, with that of military action as an alternative to robust military capabilities, or a means of cutting the defense budget. Rather, it provides a more credible type of deterrent for scenarios either that do not rise to the level of gravity where a direct and lethal military response would be appropriate, or that challenge U.S. and allied military capabilities to the point where a military response may not be successful, at least not on its own. Then there is Taiwan. It may represent the most dangerous flashpoint in the U.S.-China relationship, with China viewing the island of 23 million as integral to its own territory and the United States seeing Taiwan as a valuable democratic partner, and with some others viewing America's commitment to Taiwan as a canary in the coal mine on its broader commitment to Asian allies in the face of China's rise. Deterring China from attacking Taiwan, however, should be a doable strategic task provided that Taiwan itself does not force the issue of independence. An attempt to invade and conquer Taiwan would be a huge strategic roll of the dice by Beijing, with a high probability of failure. Taipei as well as Washington have options to make its prospects even less likely in the coming years with the right kinds of military modernizations that put sensors and anti-ship missiles on survivable locations on shore, and on survivable platforms like the XQ-58A unmanned aircraft that can be launched like a rocket and recovered by parachute. These are the best ways to more confidently deter an invasion attempt. A Chinese blockade might have better prospects of tactical military success if the goal is to squeeze Taiwan into submission economically. But blockade is also a much more indirect and uncertain form of military coercion than an invasion. It also carries, just like the invasion scenario, considerable escalation risks of its own. So yes, to deter Chinese attacks, especially on Taiwan, we must stay focused intently on military modernization efforts across the board. Concentrating on China as a pacing challenge, our most consequential strategic competitor in military and technological terms, is wise. But in some other ways, we may go too far. Take, for example, the Biden administration's highly inflammatory use of the term genocide to describe China's treatment of its Uyghur population in Xinjiang province, as witnessed in the U.S. 2022 National Security Strategy and other pronouncements. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had accused China of the same heinous crime in the latter weeks of the Trump administration. I would submit that this is not the right term and words matter in such domains. Beijing does commit severe repression against the Uyghurs. It should be held accountable for that repression. A recent UN Human Rights Council investigative report shows the correct language, determining that China has been committing serious human rights violations in its August 2022 report on the subject, unlike the U.S. Department of State under both Pompeo and Blinken. But diluting a culture and even curtailing some reproductive rights, however morally and politically reprehensible, do not constitute genocide. That latter term has a clear and palpable historical and political meaning that conjures up images of gas chambers and mass butchery. Whatever the lawyers may be able to argue, what China does in Xinjiang is terrible, but it is not genocide. I do not know how seriously offended Chinese leaders find the use of that term. But its use has provoked a significant row between China and Canada in recent months. It would appear that the term is indeed inflammatory as well as insulting to Beijing. It is also increasingly common to hear China described, at least by national security hawks, as an adversary or enemy. This approach risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, convincing us that a military showdown is at some point inevitable when that mindset could increase the risks of a crisis escalating. It could also lead us, wittingly or unwittingly, to support Taiwan's aspirations for independence more than prudence should dictate. If that American attitude encouraged Taiwan to pursue independence, the result could be calamitous. China has for years promised that such a policy decision by Taipei would mean war. As H.R. McMaster's excellent article in The Atlantic a few years ago underscored, there is too much swagger in Xi's inner circle. Yet there do also seem to be checks and balances, and a measure of restraint on matters that go well beyond the use of force. Notably, to date Beijing appears not to have sent any weaponry to Russia during the war in Ukraine, despite Putin's requests that China do so. Yet the Pentagon's 2022 annual report to Congress on China does not acknowledge this crucial limitation in China-Russia cooperation. We risk taking it for granted, or overlooking it, when in fact it is a very important and desirable reality. The recent dismissals of China's peace proposal for the war in Ukraine by important Western officials were also too reflexive and categorical. The proposal is no silver bullet for ending the war, but its opposition to nuclear weapons usage and insistence on the importance of state sovereignty in world affairs were not inconsistent with American interests or positions. Yet several Western leaders reacted quickly and sweepingly in their surprising denunciation of Beijing's ideas. China's military budget, while robust, remains at less than 2% of GDP, the level considered a minimally acceptable effort, on burden-sharing terms, within the NATO alliance. Of course, NATO is a defensive alliance and China's recent actions are often too assertive. Yet the point is not that China is unthreatening, only that by most metrics, it is not engaged in blatant arms racing either. China's ambitions to build perhaps 1,500 nuclear warheads, around 5 times what it has contented itself with in the past, may be regrettable. But a superpower like the United States with 5,000 warheads of its own should not be surprised that a rising superpower like the PRC desires to have 1/3 of that total itself. China's decision to pursue a nuclear buildup may be lamentable and may complicate American strategy, but it is not, in and of itself, reckless. The Pentagon also harps on the fact that, by ship count, China now has the world's largest navy. It generally fails to note, however, that America's naval tonnage exceeds China's by a ratio of about 2 to 1 because U.S. ships are typically much bigger. Neither metric is adequate as a way of understanding the military balance or predicting combat outcomes. Both, and others as well, need to be considered in any serious net assessment. Again, the point is not that China's military rise is inconsequential for American force planning, only that it reflects, to a large extent, natural behavior for a great power. Indeed, by the standards of the history of rising powers, China's military buildup and its recent record on the use of force are both relatively restrained. Rather than pit China as already an adversary, as some prominent American voices have already done, it is better to view it as a rival and competitor, but also one that we should try to steer back toward the rules-based international order with a long-term goal of fostering cooperation. What about the possibility of both Russia and China confronting the West militarily at the same time? Although the U.S. defense posture is only designed to handle one such war at a time, it is indeed prudent to consider the possibility. Militarily, it is crucial that we not allow either country to achieve and accomplish quickly as a result of teaming together, that would tempt deterrence failure. Hence the importance of protecting Eastern Europe with forward U.S. and NATO military deployments and ensuring that Taiwan with or even without American and Allied help can fend off a Chinese amphibious assault effectively. But I do not see much evidence about a true anti-American axis emerging in Moscow or Beijing. Again, the latter has chosen not to provide weaponry to the former during the war in Ukraine, at least as of this writing in the spring of 2023. That restraint has perhaps partly been due to fear of Western economic retaliation. But it likely also reflected Beijing's desire not to throw further fuel on the fire, with all of this war's adverse consequences for the global economy. It is more comfortable protecting Putin's back rhetorically and economically than militarily. A chief goal of U.S. national security policy should be to keep things that way, avoiding policies that would unnecessarily drive Russia and China closer together. I also believe that the difficulty of deterring Russia from attacking NATO territory in Europe is moderate at most. Proper forward stationing of defense assets in Eastern Alliance member states should be up to the task, given the limitations on Russia's military capabilities as well as the impressive strength and cohesive of the NATO alliance. It is largely for this reason that I do not think American combat forces need to be sized and structured for a possible war against both China and Russia at once. However, my relatively sanguine assessment depends on the outcome of the current war in Ukraine that seeks to offer some way for Russia eventually to rejoin the international community in good standing. Notably, Ukraine should not in my view be brought into NATO. Alternative security structures are needed instead. In terms of smaller threats, consider the Korean Peninsula. There, the U.S. presence is already correctly sized and situated to deter war, working in conjunction with Republic of Korea forces and with a clear strategic link to the American nuclear deterrent. As such, the United States does not need a true global two-war capability to ensure peace on the peninsula. That is good news because a robust two-war capability is a standard that the United States has often struggled to meet in the past even when it attempted to do so. Thus, in my view, the Biden administration's 2022 national defense strategy is correct to focus on fighting only a single adversary at a time. To wit, it says, building on the 2018 NDS National Defense Strategy, the 2022 NDS force planning constructs sizes and shapes the joint force to simultaneously defend the homeland, maintain strategic deterrence, and deter and, if necessary, prevail in conflict. In some ways, this sentence understates the capabilities of the strategy. Even in the event of a war against Russia or China, forward station forces in the other theater will likely remain in position, providing a measure of capability. Because any attack against them, say, against U.S. forces stationed in Poland and or the Baltic states and Romania, would almost inevitably lead to American retaliation. If not immediately, then eventually some degree of deterrence would likely remain. That is also true, thankfully, on the Korean Peninsula. Our system of treaty-based alliances and forward-based military forces has helped keep the great power peace for 77 years, through thick and thin. There is good reason to believe it can do so in the future as well, even in today's troubling and complex threat environment. These are troubling and often tragic times around the world. But it remains an era of great power peace. With vigilance and wisdom and with resoluteness in defense of core interests, combined with restraint in the development of any new allies as well as in crisis management, the United States and its allies have a very good chance of keeping it that way.
中国未来暗淡无光，因为党已经迷失了方向，领导层变得无能。我们不应低估中国应对困境的能力。欢迎收看智库简报：中国经济放缓的原因和影响。战略与国际研究中心。这篇评论是关于2023年8月31日 Freeman Chair Jude Blanchett 和 Trustee Chair Scott Kennedy 的一次圆桌讨论的预览，讨论如何最好的分析中国经济并展望未来。近几周来，对中国经济的情绪越来越消极，公众舆论各种各样的强调了债务、人口结构和中国与西方关系恶化等结构性问题。这篇评论反思了各种观点及其基础数据，讨论了如何评判中国经济未来表现的指标，并考虑了对美国和世界其他地区的影响。上早宣布经济永久放缓。Scott Kennedy 高级顾问和董事会主席根据媒体报道，人们肯定会认为中国经济处于危机边缘。报告似乎普遍持消极态度，以至于我的怀疑论者雷达正在闪烁鲜红的警告，告诉我不要太快接受常识。在分析师中，大多数人同意外交关系委员会的刘宗元和 Rhodium Group 的洛根、赖特以及 CSIS 的观点，及长期的结构性问题，如债务和人口结构，终于开始产生影响。彼得森国际经济研究所的亚当·波森强调，习近平的国家干预主义及其引发的负面反应是主要的弱点。波森的同事尼古拉斯·拉迪是唯一的反对者，他仔细阅读数据后认为，宣布经济永久放缓为时尚早，并显示已经出现了一些小幅反弹的迹象。尽管直接观察可能会产生不具代表性的个别案例，因此可能存在偏见，但在旅行和实地研究有限的时代，对于了解实地情况的感觉和外观有一定的用处。在我的情况下，这包括过去1年内2022年9月至2023年7月对中国的3次访问。在这3次访问中，我对经济的压倒性感觉是私营企业和消费者之间存在巨大的信心危机。唯一的亮点是蓬勃发展的电动汽车行业，它如此不协调，以至于与主导的糟糕情绪形成了鲜明对比。我在北京、上海和杭州私下与的公司高管、投资者和消费者交谈时，他们提出了3个共同的关切。第一个是对新冠疫情的处理不当，特别是从2022年3月上海开始封锁以来。其他地方的封锁虽然更为局部，但仍然具有很大的破坏性和压力。突然放弃零感染的做法，只加剧了这些担忧。第二个是对私营部门的打击，特别是互联网公司，并强调共同富裕，这使商人担心他们的成功无法长久。第三个是与美国和其他先进经济体之间的竞争日益加剧，这些紧张关系增加了战争的可能性，增加了对未来获取技术、市场和资本的怀疑，并降低了与西方的常规交往和接触的可行性。我与许多人交谈时，他们对自己国家的未来和自己的前景深感不确定。这些焦虑似乎已经转化为增加的储蓄和减少的投资和消费。我认为，尽管房地产行业的低迷正在挤压钱包，但更广泛的信心下降与房地产泡沫破裂的联系较小，更多与国家整体走向错误方向的感觉有关。如果是这样的话，那么尽管当局需要解决债务和人口结构问题，真正的挑战是重新树立一个公众接受的关于中国的共同积极目标的信念，减少与西方的紧张关系，并展示出治理的基本能力。这些变化不一定会导致经济繁荣，但他们将重建一种乐观主义的感觉，这将产生更大的民众接受度，并可能带来更多的幸福感，无论经济结果如何。没有任何东西能取代房地产行业成为增长的驱动力。Logan Wright 高级研究员非常驻董事会主席，中国经济的放缓是结构性的，始于中国前所未有的信贷和投资扩张的结束。简单的说，维持中国经济高速增长的因素在全球金融危机后无法再次重复，特别是在房地产建设和地方政府投资方面。房地产行业在北京去杠杆化运动后的几年里，出人意料地表现出弹性，部分原因是 开发商用房屋销售收入取代了从影子银行借款的一种形式，而这些房屋甚至还没有开始建设。但是当销售开始下降时，这一趋势受到了加剧。2022年的封锁和新冠疫情限制使开发商突然需要削减新土地购买和新建筑，同时让购房者等待他们的房屋交付。房地产行业的衰退是中国经济放缓的主要渠道，因为该行业在其巅峰时代占 GDP 的 20% 至 25%。新的年度住房开工量下降了 57%， 在未来10年内，该行业可能仍将保持在其以前规模的一半以下。在中国经济中，没有任何其他行业能取代房地产行业成为增长的驱动力，这解释了过去2年经济增长如此剧烈放缓的原因。这些问题的加剧是中国领导层打击充满活力的私营部门企业和行业，如互联网平台公司、教育和辅导公司的结果。这些运动已经结束，但私营部门信心的损害将需要更长时间来修复。小企业和服务业企业的就业在新冠疫情限制下遭受了相当大的损失，目前尚未恢复，这影响了家庭收入和消费支出。在这些挑战的规模下，对经济的政策支持是零散、被动和范围有限的。鉴于地方政府债务负担限制了基础设施投资增长，财政政策无法应对这些挑战。此外，中国政治体制的集中化削弱了除习近平以外的任何人在传递增强信心的信息方面的可信度，实施解决方案将特别困难。John L. Holden 高级研究员非常驻董事会主席有充分的理由相信，在2012年中国共产党第18次全国代表大会之前的时期，中国共产党的高层领导人形成了一种共识，即中国的未来看起来暗淡无光，因为党已经迷失了方向，领导层变得无能。在随后的10年里，北京一直在走向重新集权和通过反腐败和意识形态运动控制行为的道路。无论这些方法是否实现了其政治目标，他们都削弱了创新和企业家精神，并使领导层对许多情况下的核心问题视而不见。这些问题不是腐败，而是与其寄生性附着的国家赞助的激励体系。在没有根本改革的情况下，腐败将始终是中国政策传导机制的一个特征。对于中国面临的许多结构性和周期性问题，实施解决方案对于任何政权来说都是艰巨的。然而，在一个已经习惯了当前一套奖惩制度的体制中，这将尤为困难。展望未来，观察中国的人们将密切关注风险回报计算是否发生变化。中国的中央经济规划者和管理者是否会被赋予更大的自由度来制定创新政策？企业家们是否会冒险将资本投入到不受国家控制的新企业中？地方官员是否会尝试解决本地问题的解决方案？这些问题的答案可能取决于中南海秘密会议上的讨论中国的未来是否已经得到保证，是否不再需要通过国家安全的视角来看待一切。敬请关注。我们不应低估中国应对困境的能力。Claire Reid 高级研究员非常驻董事会主席。许多评论家认为中国最近的数据预示着中国经济的重大放缓，给中国和世界带来了新的风险。一个问题是，所有这些对中国与美国等贸易伙伴的互动意味着什么？中国会采取防御和分心的态度，还是对某些经济改革持开放态度？或者他是否更愿意做出贸易让步，以保持外部环境的稳定，同时专注于国内事务？首先，重要的是要记住，中国过去面临过重大的经济挑战，而且总能应对困境。我们不应低估中国再次应对困境的能力，即使它的超高经济增长的辉煌时期已经过去。中国的经济困境不会让华盛顿和其他贸易伙伴的事情变得更容易。没有人应该认为中国目前的担忧会使其更愿意做出让步。事实上，在许多情况下，他可能会更不愿意。中国不会就违背其自身利益的结果进行谈判。这种自身利益既包括实质政策的影响，也包括面子的关键维度，结果是否符合中国的重要性和形象。习近平总书记谴责美国的出口管制、制裁和投资政策。他说，这些政策旨在压制中国，并导致其他国家走向错误的方向。因此，从面子的角度来看，中国将抵制任何有助于美国的经济结果。习近平还明确表示，中国需要减少对西方的依赖，因此，如果中国同意任何市场改革措施，它将只能促进习近平寻求的优质投资。这意味着， 只鼓励外国在中国感到落后，并希望引入外国专业知识的领域参与。目前为止，这对于任何美国谈判代表来说都是一个棘手的领域。除了对达成重大贸易或商业结果的现有限制之外，如果中国官员对中国面临的经济挑战感到压力，他们在与市场经济进行谈判时可能会更加谨慎，而不是更加放松。中国的政策变化需要在政治上没有任何负面